Our first story comes from someone who learned that kindness can show up in the smallest moments when you need it most. The stranger who paid for my coffee. This happened about 3 years ago, but I still think about it probably once a week. I was having one of those mornings where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I overslept, missed my usual train, spilled toothpaste on my shirt, the whole disaster package. I was running about 40 minutes late for work and desperately needed coffee to function like a human being. I rushed into this little coffee shop near my office that I'd been to maybe twice before. Nothing fancy, just one of those places where the barista knows your order if you come in regularly. But since I wasn't a regular, I had to actually think about what I wanted. The line was longer than usual, probably because everyone else was also running late and needed their caffeine fix. When I finally got to the counter, I ordered my usual large coffee with cream and reached into my pocket for my wallet. That's when my stomach dropped. No wallet. I patted down every pocket, checked my bag twice, even looked on the floor thinking maybe I'd dropped it. Nothing. I'd left my wallet on my kitchen counter in my rush to get out the door. The barista was looking at me expectantly, and there were probably 6 people behind me, in line getting increasingly impatient. I could feel my face turning red as I stammered out an explanation about forgetting my wallet and how sorry I was for holding up the line. I was about to just leave and face the day without coffee, which honestly felt like adding insult to injury at that point. That's when the woman behind me stepped forward. She was probably in her 50s, wearing scrubs like she worked at a hospital or clinic nearby. She didn't make a big show of it or anything, just quietly told the barista she'd cover my coffee. I tried to protest, saying I could come back later or just skip it, but she insisted. She said we all have those mornings and that she hoped someone would do the same for her daughter if she was in a similar situation. The whole interaction took maybe 30 seconds, but it completely changed my day. Not just because I got my coffee, but because this complete stranger had shown me kindness when I was feeling frazzled and embarrassed. She didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, and probably forgot about the interaction before she even left the coffee shop. I tried to get her name or contact information so I could pay her back, but she waved me off and said to just do something nice for someone else when I got the chance. I never saw her again, despite going to that coffee shop more regularly, hoping I might run into her. That small gesture, probably costing her less than $5, turned what was shaping up to be a terrible day into something manageable. I got to work with a completely different energy, and I found myself being more patient with difficult customers and more helpful to my co-workers. It was like her kindness had this ripple effect that spread through my entire day. Since then, I've made it a point to look for opportunities to do the same for others. I've paid for people's groceries when their card got declined, covered parking meters that were about to expire for strangers, and helped people carry heavy bags up subway stairs. None of these things cost much money or took much time, but I remember how grateful people looked when someone showed them that small kindness. The crazy thing is that doing nice things for others makes me feel almost as good as it felt when that woman helped me. There's something about those tiny moments of human connection that reminds you most people are good, even when the world feels overwhelming or cruel. I still wonder about that woman sometimes. I hope she knows that her simple act of kindness 3 years ago is still inspiring kindness today, and probably will be for years to come. She taught me that you don't need grand gestures or lots of money to make a real difference in someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is recognizing when someone is having a rough moment and deciding to help, even in the smallest way. That story ends there. And honestly, this is exactly why I love reading these Reddit posts. This person's entire perspective on kindness shifted because someone spent $5 on coffee. It's wild how the smallest gestures can create these massive ripple effects that last for years. Makes you wonder how many opportunities we miss every day to completely change someone's trajectory with barely any effort. Let's move to our next story, which comes from someone who learned that failure isn't the end of the world, it's just the beginning of understanding. The day I failed my driving test. I'm Kelly, and I need to share this story because it changed how I think about failure completely. I was 17 and had been looking forward to getting my license for months. All my friends had already passed their driving tests, and I was starting to feel left behind. I studied the manual until I could recite it backwards, practiced parallel parking until my dad got tired of sitting in the passenger seat, and took probably 50 practice tests online until I was scoring perfect every time. The day of my actual driving test, I felt confident, maybe too confident. I showed up early, had all my paperwork ready, and when the instructor got in the car with me, I was ready to ace this thing and finally join my friends in the land of licensed drivers. Everything started fine. I adjusted my mirrors, put on my seatbelt, checked my blind spots. The instructor seemed nice enough, just this middle-aged guy who probably did 5 of these tests every day. We pulled out of the parking lot, and I was feeling good about my smooth acceleration and proper signalling. Then we got to the parallel parking section, which I had practiced more than anything else. I lined up next to the car in front of the space, just like I'd done hundreds of times with my dad. Started backing up, turning the wheel, checking my mirrors, but something felt off. I was either too close to the curb or too far away, and I couldn't seem to find that sweet spot I'd nailed so many times in practice. I tried to adjust, pulling forward and backing up again. Then again. The instructor wasn't saying anything, just making notes on his clipboard, which made me even more nervous. By my 4th attempt at getting into the space properly, my palms were sweating and I could feel my heart racing. I finally managed to get the car between the lines, but I knew it wasn't my best work. The rest of the test didn't go much better. I was so rattled from the parking situation that I rolled through a stop sign without coming to a complete stop. Not dangerously or anything, but enough that I knew I'd messed up the second it happened. Then at a 4-way stop, I hesitated too long trying to figure out who had the right of way, and the instructor had to remind me to proceed. When we got back to the DMV, I already knew before he told me, failed. I had to sit there while he explained which parts I hadn't passed and what I needed to work on before retaking the test. The parallel parking, the rolling stop, and something about not being decisive enough at intersections. I was mortified. This was supposed to be the day I became an independent adult who could drive herself to work and school and social events. Instead, I was going to have to ask my parents for rides for at least another few weeks while I practiced more and waited to retake the test. I called my mum from the parking lot, trying not to cry while I explained that I'd failed. She was sympathetic and said these things happen, but I could tell she was surprised since I'd seemed so prepared. The worst part was having to tell my friends later that day. They were all expecting to hear about my successful test, and instead, I had to admit I'd failed at something they'd all managed to do on their first try. That's when the driving instructor did something I'll never forget. As I was gathering my stuff to leave, feeling completely defeated, he stopped me and said something that changed my entire perspective on failure. He told me he'd been giving driving tests for 12 years and had seen thousands of people take this test. He said the people who failed their first time almost always became better drivers than the ones who passed immediately. He explained that failure forces you to really understand what went wrong and fix it, while people who pass easily sometimes develop bad habits later because they never had to confront their mistakes. He said I was clearly a careful person who took driving seriously, and that the nervousness I'd felt during the test showed I understood how important it was to be safe on the road. He told me to practice for another week, come back when I felt ready, and that he was confident I'd pass the second time. 2 weeks later, I retook the test with a different instructor and passed easily. But more importantly, I realised that failing the first time had actually made me a more thoughtful, careful driver. I paid more attention to details, double-checked everything, and never took for granted that I knew what I was doing. Years later, I've applied that lesson to so many other areas of my life. When I failed my first job interview, I used the feedback to improve my presentation skills. When I failed a college course, I learned better study habits that helped me succeed in harder classes later. When my first serious relationship ended, I reflected on what went wrong and became a better partner in future relationships. That driving instructor taught me that failure isn't something shameful to hide from. It's information. It's your brain's way of saying you need to pay attention to something you missed the first time. The people who are afraid to fail are often the ones who never push themselves hard enough to really succeed at anything meaningful. Now, when I see friends or co-workers beating themselves up over mistakes, I try to share what that instructor taught me. Failure doesn't define you. It refines you. Every successful person has a collection of failures that taught them what they needed to know to eventually succeed. I still have my license from that second test, and sometimes when I'm facing a new challenge, I remember that day at the DMV. Not the embarrassment of failing, but the relief of learning that failure was just the first step toward really understanding something important. That story wraps up there. Kelly's driving instructor sounds like he should write a book on growth mindset, because that's exactly the kind of perspective that separates people who bounce back from people who stay stuck. Failure as information instead of judgment is such a powerful way to look at setbacks. I bet Kelly approaches challenges completely differently now because of that one conversation. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the most valuable things in life aren't valuable because of what they cost. My grandpa's broken watch. I'm Marcus, and this story is about my grandfather and a watch that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, but meant everything to him. My grandpa worked construction his entire adult life, starting when he was 16 and continuing until he was almost 70. He had these massive, calloused hands that looked like they could crush a brick, but he was the gentlest person I've ever known. For as long as I can remember, my grandpa wore the same watch every single day. It was this old silver thing with a cracked face and a leather band that was so worn it was practically falling apart. The numbers on the face were faded, and you had to hold it at just the right angle to see what time it was. The band was held together with electrical tape in 2 different places, and sometimes the watch would just stop working for hours at a time before mysteriously starting again. As a kid, I was embarrassed by that watch. When we'd go out to dinner or to church, I'd notice other people wearing nice, shiny watches that actually looked like they were worth something. My grandpa's watch looked like something he'd found in a dumpster, and I couldn't understand why someone who worked so hard wouldn't just buy himself a decent timepiece. When I was about 12, I started saving up my allowance and birthday money to buy him a new watch for Christmas. I had seen this really nice one at the department store for about $60, which seemed like a fortune to me at the time. But I was determined to get it for him. It had a clean white face, a proper leather band, and it looked like something a successful person would wear. Christmas morning came, and I was so excited to give him his present. When he unwrapped it, his face lit up, and he thanked me profusely, saying it was the most thoughtful gift anyone had ever given him. He put it on immediately and wore it for the rest of Christmas Day, showing it off to my aunts and uncles and telling everyone how generous I was. But the next day, he was wearing his old broken watch again. I was confused and a little hurt. Had he not liked my gift? Was there something wrong with the new watch? I asked him about it, and that's when he told me the story behind his old watch. He explained that he'd bought that watch in 1967 with his first paycheck from his first real construction job. He was 22 years old, newly married to my grandmother, and they were living in a tiny apartment and saving every penny they could. But he'd decided he needed a watch for work, something that could handle the rough conditions of a construction site. He told me he'd gone to 3 different stores comparing prices before settling on that watch, because it was reliable and he could afford it without taking money away from rent or groceries. He wore it to work every day for 43 years. It had been with him when he built houses, office buildings, schools and hospitals. It had survived concrete dust, rain, extreme heat and bitter cold. The crack in the face happened when he fell off a scaffold in 1979 and landed hard on his wrist. He could have died from that fall, but he walked away with just some bruises and a cracked watch. He said every time he looked at that crack, he remembered how grateful he was to be alive and how important it was to be careful on the job. The worn leather band had moulded to his wrist over decades of wear. He showed me how it fit perfectly, how he could tell the time even in the dark, just by the way it felt on his arm. He said that watch had been with him through every important moment of his working life, through promotions and layoffs, good days and terrible days. Most importantly, he told me, that watch represented something valuable that had nothing to do with money. It represented 43 years of showing up to work, of providing for his family, of building things that would last long after he was gone. Every scratch and dent was a memory. Every repair was a reminder of his persistence. He said the new watch I'd given him was beautiful, and he would treasure it forever. But he couldn't retire his work watch until he retired from work. That old, broken-looking timepiece was a symbol of his life's work, and he wore it with pride every day. My grandpa finally retired when I was 15, and on his last day of work, he took off that old watch and put it in a small box on his dresser. He wore the watch I'd given him for special occasions after that, but he never threw away his construction watch. When he passed away 2 years ago, my grandmother gave me that old watch. She said he'd wanted me to have it because I was the one who'd cared enough to try to replace it, which meant I was the one who would understand what it really meant. I wear it sometimes now, and every time I look at that cracked face or feel that worn leather band, I think about my grandfather's hands and his dedication to his family. I think about how he found value in persistence and meaning in hard work. I think about how the things that matter most in life aren't the things that look impressive to other people. That watch taught me that worth isn't determined by price tags or appearance. Worth comes from the stories something carries, the memories it holds, the significance we give it through our experiences. My grandfather's broken watch was worth more than any luxury timepiece because it represented a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and dedication. Now when I see something old or worn or seemingly worthless, I try to remember that lesson. I try to look beyond the surface and consider what stories that thing might hold, what meaning it might have for someone else. Value isn't always visible from the outside. That story ends there. Marcus learned something most people never figure out. That meaning beats money every single time. His grandfather wasn't wearing a broken watch. He was wearing a trophy that represented 4 decades of dedication. That's the kind of wisdom that only comes from really paying attention to the people who matter most to you. Let's move on to a story about friendship and the painful lesson that authenticity matters more than popularity. The time my friend died to impress others. This one's from someone who learned the hard way that fake friends and fake stories eventually catch up with you. I'm going to keep this person anonymous because honestly, the betrayal they experienced was rough enough without putting their name out there. I had this friend in high school named Jake, who I thought was one of the coolest people I'd ever met. We became close during our sophomore year when we got paired up for a chemistry lab, and from day one, Jake had these incredible stories about his life outside of school. He talked about going to exclusive parties with college kids, dating girls from private schools in other towns, and having these wild adventures that made my weekend plans of playing video games seem pretty pathetic. Jake would come to school on Monday mornings with detailed stories about concerts he'd been to, fights he'd broken up, celebrities he'd supposedly met at some event his older cousin had brought him to. He always had just enough specific details to make everything sound completely believable, and he told these stories with such confidence that I never thought to question them. Other kids at school started gravitating toward Jake because of these stories. He became this magnetic personality that everyone wanted to be around, and by association, I suddenly found myself part of the popular crowd for the first time in my life. It felt amazing to be included in conversations with people who had never noticed me before Jake and I became friends. The stories kept getting bigger and more elaborate as Jake realised how much attention they brought him. He started talking about his dad's connections in the music industry, weekend trips to exclusive resorts, and expensive gifts he'd supposedly received from mysterious relatives. He'd show up wearing new clothes or accessories and spin elaborate tales about where they came from. I started feeling pressure to contribute interesting stories of my own, but my life was pretty normal, compared to Jake's supposed adventures. I felt boring and ordinary next to his constant stream of excitement, so I began stretching the truth about my own experiences. Nothing major at first, just making ordinary events sound more dramatic or interesting than they actually were. But Jake's influence was changing me in ways I didn't recognize at the time. I started judging other people by how interesting their stories were, dismissing kids who lived normal lives like mine as boring or beneath me. I was becoming someone I wouldn't have liked if I'd met him before Jake came into my life. The whole thing came crashing down during our junior year when Jake made a mistake that exposed everything. He told this elaborate story about meeting some famous musician at a concert the previous weekend, complete with details about backstage access and getting phone numbers from the band members. The problem was that one of our classmates had actually been at that same concert with his older brother, and the musician Jake claimed to have met hadn't even performed that night. When confronted about the inconsistency, Jake tried to cover by saying he'd mixed up which concert it was, but the damage was done. People started looking more critically at all of his stories, and once you start questioning one lie, it becomes easier to spot the others. The expensive clothes turned out to be knockoffs he'd bought online. The exclusive parties were actually just regular house parties he'd heard about secondhand. The celebrity encounters were complete fabrications. The most painful part was realizing that I'd been complicit in the deception. I'd never directly called Jake out when his stories seemed too good to be true, and I'd started exaggerating my own experiences to keep up with his fictional lifestyle. I'd become someone who valued impression management over honest friendship. When everything came to light, the social circle that had formed around Jake's stories dissolved immediately. People felt manipulated and embarrassed that they'd been impressed by lies, but more than that, they felt like Jake had made fools of them by treating their genuine friendship and admiration as something he could manipulate for his own ego. I tried to maintain my friendship with Jake after the truth came out, thinking maybe we could rebuild something authentic from the wreckage. But I realized that I didn't actually know who Jake was underneath all the stories. Our entire friendship had been built on a foundation of lies and performance, and without that, we didn't have much in common. Jake transferred schools partway through our senior year, and I heard later that he'd tried to reinvent himself at his new school with a completely different set of fabricated stories. Some people just can't seem to accept that their real life is enough to build genuine relationships on. The experience taught me that authenticity might not always be the most impressive option, but it's the only one that builds lasting connections. People can sense when you're being real with them, and that honesty creates trust that no amount of exciting stories can match. I'd learned to appreciate friends who lived ordinary lives, but shared them honestly over people who spun elaborate tales to capture attention. Real friendship is built on shared experiences and genuine connection, not on being impressed by each other's highlight reels. Now, when I meet someone who seems to have unusually exciting stories about everything in their life, I pay attention to how they treat people when there's nothing to be gained from impressing them. That usually tells you everything you need to know about whether their friendship is worth pursuing. That story ends there. Jake basically turned himself into a human Instagram feed, all highlight reel and no substance. The saddest part is that he probably had qualities worth knowing, but he buried them under so many lies that nobody ever got to see who he really was. Authenticity isn't always flashy, but at least it's real. When you build friendships on lies, you're not really building friendships at all. Let's move to a story about how one teacher's belief can completely change the trajectory of someone's life. The teacher who believed in me. I'm Sarah, and this story is about Mrs. Rodriguez and how she saw something in me that I didn't even know existed. I was in 8th grade, going through that awkward phase where everything feels terrible and nothing seems to go right. My parents were going through a messy divorce. I was dealing with the usual middle school social drama, and I felt invisible most of the time. I'd always been an average student, not particularly good at anything, but not failing either. I did my homework, showed up to class, and flew under the radar as much as possible. Most of my teachers probably couldn't have picked me out of a lineup, which was exactly how I preferred it. Being noticed usually meant being in trouble, and I had enough problems at home without adding school drama to the mix. Mrs. Rodriguez taught 8th grade English, and she was one of those teachers who seemed to actually care about what she was doing instead of just going through the motions until retirement. She was probably in her 30s, always enthusiastic about whatever book we were reading, and she had this way of asking questions that made you think about things differently than you had before. We were assigned to write a personal narrative essay about a meaningful experience from our childhood. Most kids groaned about the assignment because writing essays wasn't exactly the highlight of anyone's day. But I actually didn't mind writing when I could choose what to talk about. I wrote about the summer I spent with my grandfather before he passed away, helping him work in his garden and listening to his stories about growing up during the Great Depression. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just memories of an 8-year-old kid learning about patience and persistence from an old man who found joy in growing vegetables. I turned in my essay, expecting to get it back with a grade and maybe a few correction marks, then never think about it again. But Mrs. Rodriguez had other plans. A few days later, she asked me to stay after class, and I immediately assumed I was in trouble for something. Maybe I'd made too many grammar mistakes, or maybe she thought I'd made up the stories about my grandfather. Instead, she told me that my essay was exceptional. She said I had a natural talent for storytelling and that I'd managed to make her care about my grandfather, even though she'd never met him. She said my writing had what she called an authentic voice, something that couldn't be taught but was incredibly valuable. I honestly didn't know how to respond. No teacher had ever told me I was good at anything before, let alone exceptionally good. I assumed she was just being nice because she could tell I was having a rough time at home, but she kept talking about specific things in my essay that had impressed her. She asked if I'd ever considered joining the school newspaper or entering writing contests. I told her I'd never really thought about writing as something I could be good at, just something everyone had to do for school assignments. She said that was exactly why my writing was so refreshing, because I wasn't trying to sound like what I thought good writing should sound like. Mrs. Rodriguez suggested I submit my essay to a regional middle school writing competition. I was terrified of the idea because what if it wasn't actually good and I just embarrassed myself in front of a bunch of real writers? But she was so confident in my work that I eventually agreed to let her submit it. 3 weeks later, she called me up to her desk with this huge smile and told me my essay had won 2nd place out of over 300 submissions from schools across the state. I couldn't believe it. Me, the invisible kid who was just trying to get through 8th grade without falling apart, had actually won something for writing. But the real impact wasn't the award. It was the way Mrs. Rodriguez had seen potential in me that I didn't know existed. She started encouraging me to write more, giving me extra assignments that were actually fun instead of feeling like work. She introduced me to authors I'd never heard of and helped me understand why their writing was powerful. By the end of 8th grade, I was thinking about high school differently. Instead of just trying to survive 4 more years of school, I started planning to take advanced English classes and maybe join the school literary magazine. Mrs. Rodriguez had given me an identity beyond just being the quiet kid from the broken home. High school went much better than middle school, partly because I had something I was genuinely good at and passionate about. I wrote for the school newspaper, won a few more contests, and started thinking about college as a real possibility, instead of just something other people did. When it came time to apply for colleges, Mrs. Rodriguez wrote me a recommendation letter that apparently made quite an impression because I got accepted to several schools, with partial scholarships based on my writing portfolio. I ended up majoring in journalism and now work as a reporter for a regional newspaper. I still have that first essay I wrote about my grandfather, and I think about Mrs. Rodriguez every time I sit down to write something important. She taught me that everyone has stories worth telling, but more importantly, she taught me that believing in someone can literally change their life trajectory. Last year, I went back to visit my old middle school and found Mrs. Rodriguez still teaching 8th grade English. I brought her a copy of an investigative series I'd written that won a state journalism award, and I told her that none of it would have happened without that first conversation after class 15 years ago. She said she remembered that essay and that she still used it as an example of authentic voice when teaching her current students. She said she'd always known I had something special, but that the real credit belonged to me for having the courage to develop that gift once I knew it existed. The truth is, I probably had that writing ability all along, but I never would have discovered it without someone taking the time to notice and encourage it. Mrs. Rodriguez didn't just teach me about writing. She taught me that sometimes all someone needs is one person who believes in their potential. Now, when I interview people for articles, I try to listen for those moments when someone mentions something they're passionate about, but don't think they're good enough to pursue seriously. Sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "You have something worth developing," to change everything. That story wraps up there. Mrs. Rodriguez understood something that most people miss, that potential is everywhere, but confidence is rare. Sarah probably had dozens of teachers, but only one took the time to see what she was capable of and say something about it. That's the kind of teacher who changes lives without even trying. One conversation after class became a career 15 years later. Our next story comes from someone who learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear, especially when it's for someone else. The day I stood up to a bully. This happened when I was in 6th grade, and honestly, it's the moment I learned what courage actually feels like. I was pretty small for my age, one of those kids who tried to be invisible because being noticed usually meant becoming someone's target. I wasn't athletic, wasn't particularly funny or popular, just a quiet kid who wanted to get through school without any drama. There was this kid in my grade named Marcus, who had some kind of learning disability that made him process information slower than everyone else. He was in regular classes with the rest of us, but he needed extra time to understand things and sometimes asked questions that other kids thought were obvious. Marcus was actually really sweet, always willing to help if someone dropped their books or forgot their lunch money, but some kids saw his differences as an opportunity for entertainment, or the worst of than most of us, and had this mean these kids was Tyler, who was bigger streak that seemed to come out of nowhere. Tyler would wait for moments when teachers weren't looking to make comments about Marcus being stupid or slow. He'd knock Marcus's books out of his hands in the hallway, hide his backpack during lunch, or ask him deliberately confusing questions just to watch him struggle with the answers. Most of us just watched this happen without saying anything. We told ourselves it wasn't our business or that getting involved would just make Tyler target us too. I felt bad for Marcus, but I was honestly relieved that Tyler's attention was focused on someone else, because it meant I could stay under the radar. This went on for months. Marcus never seemed to fight back or report what was happening. He just endured it with this sad resignation that made me feel guilty every time I witnessed it. I started avoiding situations where I might have to watch Tyler torment Marcus because seeing it made me feel like a coward. The incident that changed everything happened during lunch period in the cafeteria. Marcus was sitting alone at a table near the window, eating his sandwich and reading a book like he always did. Tyler and a couple of his friends walked over and started their usual routine of asking Marcus questions designed to make him look stupid. But this time, Tyler escalated things. He grabbed Marcus's book and started reading from it in this exaggerated, mocking voice, pretending to be Marcus trying to understand the words. Marcus asked quietly for his book back, which just made Tyler and his friends laugh harder. Then Tyler threw the book across the cafeteria, pages fluttering everywhere, and told Marcus to go fetch it like a dog. That's when something inside me snapped. I wasn't brave, I wasn't tough, and I definitely wasn't looking for a fight with someone who could easily overpower me. But watching Marcus's face, as he tried not to cry while other kids laughed at his humiliation, made me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. I stood up from my table and walked over to where Tyler was still laughing with his friends. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking, but I looked Tyler in the eye and told him to leave Marcus alone. Tyler seemed surprised that anyone had said anything, especially someone like me, who usually tried to be invisible. Tyler asked me what I was going to do about it, clearly expecting me to back down like I always had before. But instead of running away, I told him that picking on someone who couldn't defend themselves didn't make him tough. It made him pathetic. I said anyone could be mean to someone smaller and quieter, but it took real strength to be kind to people who were different. The cafeteria had gotten quiet around us, and I realized other kids were watching to see what would happen. Tyler looked embarrassed that someone had called him out publicly, and he took a step toward me, like he was going to do something physical. I was terrified, but I didn't move. That's when something unexpected happened. 3 other kids from my grade stood up and came over to stand next to me, then a few more. Within a minute, there were probably 8 or 9 kids standing between Tyler and Marcus, all of us quiet but clearly united in saying this wasn't okay. Tyler realized he was suddenly outnumbered by kids who were tired of watching him torment Marcus. He tried to save face by saying we were all being ridiculous and that he was just joking around, but nobody was buying it. He and his friends left the cafeteria, and someone went to collect the pages of Marcus's book, while someone else helped him clean up his lunch. Marcus thanked me quietly, but what struck me most was the look in his eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was surprise that someone had actually stood up for him, after months of being treated like he was invisible or worthless. That look taught me that sometimes the impact of standing up for someone goes way beyond just stopping one incident. After that day, Tyler never bothered Marcus again. Not because Tyler had suddenly become a better person, but because he realized other kids were watching and wouldn't just stand by silently anymore. The dynamic had shifted, and Marcus was no longer an easy target because he had people who would defend him. But the bigger change was in me. I'd spent years being afraid of confrontation, worried that standing out would make me a target. But defending Marcus taught me that there are things worth risking your own comfort for, and that courage isn't about not being scared, it's about acting despite being scared. I became more confident in other areas of my life after that. I tried out for academic teams I had been too nervous to join before, spoke up in class when I had something to contribute, and stopped worrying so much about what other people thought of me. Standing up to Tyler had shown me that I was braver than I realized. Marcus and I became genuine friends after that incident, and I learned that he was actually incredibly smart, just in ways that didn't always show up in traditional classroom settings. He had this amazing memory for details and could solve problems by thinking about them from angles other people missed. Years later, in high school, Marcus was in advanced classes and ended up being valedictorian of our graduating class. His speech talked about the importance of standing up for people who are different, and he mentioned that day in the cafeteria as a turning point when he realized that not everyone would judge him for learning differently. That experience taught me that courage is contagious. When one person decides to do the right thing, it makes it easier for others to join in. Most people want to help. They just need someone to take the first step and show them it's possible. Now when I see situations where someone is being treated unfairly, I remember that day in 6th grade. I remember how scared I was, but also how right it felt to finally speak up. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just refuse to be a bystander when someone needs an ally. That story ends there. This is exactly why bullies thrive, because they count on everyone else being too scared or too comfortable to get involved. But the moment someone stands up, especially someone unexpected, the whole power dynamic shifts. This person discovered that courage isn't a personality trait you either have or don't have. It's a choice you make in the moment when it matters most. Let's move to a story about how the smallest gestures can become the biggest memories. The neighbour who always waved. I'm Laura, and this story is about Mrs. Chen and how something as simple as waving every day can leave a mark that lasts decades. Mrs. Chen lived in the house directly across the street from where I grew up, and for 15 years She was a constant, comforting presence in my daily routine. Every morning when I walked to the bus stop, Mrs. Chen would be on her front porch, usually watering her flowers or sweeping the steps. And every morning, without fail, she would see me coming and wave with this huge smile on her face. Not just a little polite wave, but this enthusiastic, genuinely happy to see you wave like I was her favourite person in the world. At first, when I was really young, I thought she waved at everyone. But as I got older, I realised she specifically looked for me each morning. If I was running late and rushed past without noticing her, she'd call out, "Good morning, Laura," to make sure I knew she was there. Mrs. Chen didn't speak much English, and I didn't speak any Mandarin, so our communication was limited to waves, smiles, and the occasional hello or have a good day. But somehow those simple exchanges felt meaningful in a way that most of my actual conversations didn't. During my elementary school years, Mrs. Chen's wave was just part of my morning routine, like brushing my teeth or grabbing my backpack. I took it for granted because it was always there, as reliable as sunrise. Some mornings I was grumpy about getting up early or nervous about a test, but seeing Mrs. Chen's genuine smile and enthusiastic wave always improved my mood at least a little bit. Middle school was rougher. I was dealing with typical teenage stuff, friendship drama, feeling awkward about everything, worrying about fitting in. Some mornings I felt so miserable that I didn't want to interact with anyone, even friendly neighbours. But Mrs. Chen never seemed to notice my mood or take it personally when I gave half-hearted waves in return. She just kept being consistently, genuinely happy to see me every single day. High school brought new challenges and a more complicated schedule. Sometimes I'd miss the bus and my mum would drive me to school, so I wouldn't see Mrs. Chen for days at a time. But whenever I did walk to the bus stop, there she was, waving like I'd never been gone. During my senior year, when I was stressed about college applications and felt like everything was changing too fast, Mrs. Chen's daily wave became this anchor of consistency in my life. The morning routine continued through all 4 years of high school. Even when I was running late, even when it was raining, even when I was having the worst day imaginable, Mrs. Chen was there with her wave. I started to realise that her consistency wasn't just coincidence. She was choosing to be there every morning, choosing to look for me, choosing to start my day with kindness. When I left for college, I made sure to go across the street and thank Mrs. Chen for all the years of morning waves. She seemed surprised that I wanted to thank her for something so simple, but she was clearly touched. She gave me a hug and said in her limited English, "You good girl, Laura, I miss you." During my college years, whenever I came home for breaks, Mrs. Chen would somehow know I was back and would be on her porch the next morning, waving like no time had passed at all. Those waves felt different now, less routine and more precious, because I understood how rare it is to find someone who shows up consistently with genuine kindness. After college, I moved to a different city for work, but I'd visit my parents a few times a year. Mrs. Chen was getting older and wasn't on her porch as often, but when she was, she'd still wave with that same enthusiasm. Her hair was greyer and she moved more slowly, but her smile when she saw me was exactly the same. The last time I saw Mrs. Chen was during a visit home about 3 years ago. She was in her 80s by then and using a walker, but she was still on her porch some mornings. When she saw me walking to my car, she waved with both hands like she used to when I was a kid. I walked across the street to talk to her, and she told me how proud she was that I'd become successful and how she'd always known I was special. My mum called me 6 months later to tell me that Mrs. Chen had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was beautiful, and I was amazed to learn how many people in our neighbourhood had similar stories about Mrs. Chen's small acts of daily kindness. She had been waving to kids on their way to school for decades, not just me. At the funeral, Mrs. Chen's daughter told me that her mother had specifically mentioned me in her final weeks. She said Mrs. Chen had talked about watching me grow up from across the street and how much joy it had brought her to be part of my daily routine. She said her mother considered all the neighbourhood kids her extended family, and that waving to us each morning was one of her favourite parts of every day. I realised then that Mrs. Chen's waves hadn't just been a nice gesture for my benefit. They had been meaningful to her too, a way of connecting with the community and sharing love in the simplest possible way. For 15 years we had been giving each other something important without either of us fully understanding the impact. Now, when I walk through my own neighbourhood, I try to be more like Mrs. Chen. I wave at kids waiting for the bus, smile at joggers who pass by my house, and make eye contact with people instead of staying buried in my phone. I've learned that small, consistent acts of kindness can become some of the most treasured memories in someone's life. Mrs. Chen taught me that you don't need grand gestures or dramatic moments to make a difference in someone's world. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just show up consistently with genuine warmth and let people know they've been seen. Her daily wave was a gift that kept giving for 15 years, and the memory of it still brings me comfort whenever I'm having a difficult morning. That story ends there. Mrs. Chen understood something profound about human connection, that consistency matters more than intensity. 15 years of simple waves created a bond that lasted a lifetime. She was basically a one-person welcome committee for the neighbourhood. And Laura's story makes me realise how many Mrs. Chens we probably walk past every day without noticing. Those small gestures that feel routine to us might be the highlight of someone else's morning. Our next story comes from someone who learned that honesty still exists in the world when you least expect it. The time I lost my wallet. This happened about 5 years ago during what was supposed to be a routine grocery shopping trip that turned into one of those moments that restores your faith in humanity. I'm Darren, and I'll be honest, I used to be pretty cynical about people's motivations, especially when it came to money and honesty. I had just finished a long day at work and needed to pick up groceries for dinner. It was one of those weeks where everything felt expensive and my budget was tight, so I'd carefully planned out exactly what I needed to buy and how much cash to bring. I had about $80 in my wallet, which was meant to cover groceries plus gas money to last me until my next paycheck. The grocery store was busy with the usual after-work crowd, and I was focused on getting in and out as quickly as possible. I grabbed a cart, went through my mental list and loaded up with pasta, vegetables, some chicken, the basics to get me through the week. Nothing fancy, just practical meals that would stretch my budget. When I got to the checkout line, I reached into my back pocket for my wallet and felt nothing. That sinking feeling hit immediately. I patted down all my pockets, checked my jacket, even looked in the grocery cart thinking maybe I'd set it down somewhere. The cashier was looking at me expectantly. There were people behind me in line getting impatient, and I was starting to panic. I told the cashier I'd somehow lost my wallet and asked if I could leave my groceries there while I retraced my steps through the store. She was understanding and said she'd hold everything for 20 minutes while I looked around. I spent those 20 minutes checking every aisle I'd been down, asking customer service if anyone had turned in a wallet, even checking the parking lot in case it had fallen out when I got out of my car. Nothing. My wallet was just gone. I had to go back and apologise to the cashier, abandon my groceries, and drive home empty-handed, trying not to think about the $80 I'd lost or how I was going to buy food for the rest of the week. Worse than the money was the hassle of having to replace my driver's license, credit cards, and insurance cards. That night, I called my bank to report my cards as stolen, started the process of getting a new license, and basically resigned myself to the fact that my wallet was gone forever. I figured whoever found it had probably taken the cash and thrown the rest away. That's just how the world works, right? People look out for themselves first. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a package on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was my wallet, completely intact. Every credit card, every piece of identification, every receipt I'd stuffed in there over the months. And tucked inside the billfold were all $80, exactly as I'd left them. There was a handwritten note on simple notebook paper that said, "Found this in the grocery store parking lot. Hope it finds its way back to you. Have a good day." No name, no contact information, no expectation of reward or recognition. Just someone who had taken the time to track down my address, probably from my driver's license, and mail my wallet back without taking anything. I stood on my front porch holding that wallet, reading the note over and over, trying to process the fact that a complete stranger had gone out of their way to return money they easily could have kept. This person had spent their own money on postage, taken time to package it up properly, and trusted the postal system to deliver it safely. The more I thought about it, the more impressed I became with the effort involved. They'd had to look up my address, find a box or envelope, drive to a post office or mailbox, pay for shipping, and do all of this without any guarantee that I'd even appreciate the gesture. They could have just turned it into store customer service and been done with it. I tried to figure out who might have found it so I could thank them properly. I called the grocery store to see if anyone had mentioned finding a wallet, posted on neighborhood social media groups, asking if anyone knew who might have returned it. Even asked my neighbors if they'd seen someone delivering packages, but whoever had done this clearly wanted to remain anonymous. That experience completely changed how I think about human nature and honesty. I'd been operating under the assumption that most people would take advantage of a situation, like finding someone's wallet, but this person had proved me wrong. They'd chosen to do the right thing, even when no one was watching, and they wouldn't get credit for it. It made me realize that my cynicism had been preventing me from seeing the good in everyday situations. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from disappointment that I'd stopped believing people could surprise me in positive ways. This stranger had given me back more than just my wallet and money. They'd given me back some faith in humanity. Since then, I've tried to be more like that person. I returned a phone I found at a coffee shop by calling the most recent number in the contact list. I turned in a $20 bill I found in a parking lot to the store manager instead of keeping it. I helped a confused tourist who was clearly lost find their way back to their hotel. None of these things were huge gestures, just basic decency that costs nothing but makes someone else's day a little better. But I probably wouldn't have made those choices if I hadn't experienced firsthand how meaningful it is when someone chooses honesty over opportunity. I still have that note tucked away in my desk drawer. Sometimes when I'm having a particularly rough day or feeling pessimistic about the world, I read it again and remember that there are people out there who do the right thing simply because it's right. That stranger taught me that integrity isn't dead, it's just quiet. That story ends there. Honestly, this is the kind of thing that makes you want to be a better person just because someone else was decent when they didn't have to be. Darren got his wallet back, but he also got something way more valuable, proof that good people exist when you're not even looking for them. It's wild how one anonymous act of honesty can completely shift someone's worldview. Moving on to our next story about learning that sometimes what feels like the worst thing that could happen is actually setting you up for something better. The coach who benched me. I'm Ethan, and this story is about the basketball season that taught me the difference between being important and being the star. I was a junior in high school, had been playing basketball since middle school, and honestly thought I was pretty good at it. I was averaging about 15 points per game, had decent stats, and expected to be one of the key players on our varsity team. Our new coach, Coach Martinez, came in that season with a completely different philosophy than our previous coach. He was all about teamwork, defense, and what he called playing the right way. He didn't seem as impressed with individual stats as he was with how players contributed to wins, but I figured that wouldn't affect me much since I was clearly one of our better scorers. The first few games of the season went well enough. I was getting decent playing time, putting up my usual numbers and feeling confident about my role on the team. But Coach Martinez kept making comments during practice about players needing to trust their teammates more and not trying to do everything themselves. About halfway through the season, everything changed. We had this big game against our crosstown rivals, a team we'd lost to the previous year in a really close game. I'd been looking forward to this matchup for months, thinking it would be my chance to prove I belonged with the best players in our league. During warm-ups, Coach Martinez pulled me aside and told me he was going to start someone else in my position. I was shocked and asked what I'd done wrong. He said I hadn't done anything wrong individually, but that he thought the team would function better with a different lineup that emphasized ball movement and defense over scoring. I spent the first quarter on the bench watching my replacement, a guy named Mike who averaged maybe 6 points per game, running plays with the starters. I was furious. Mike was a decent player, but he wasn't a scorer like I was. How could the team be better with someone who contributed less offense? But as I watched the game unfold, I started noticing things I'd missed when I was focused on my own performance. Mike wasn't scoring much, but he was setting screens that freed up other players for better shots. He was diving for loose balls, playing tough defense, and making passes that led to easy baskets for teammates. Our team was actually playing better basketball than I'd seen all season. The ball was moving more freely because nobody was trying to create their own shot every possession. Players were making extra passes to find open teammates instead of forcing difficult attempts. And our defense was more cohesive because everyone was focused on stopping the other team instead of conserving energy for offense. We won that game by 12 points, our biggest victory of the season. And as much as I hated to admit it, we'd won because the team was playing together in a way that hadn't happened when I was trying to be the primary scorer. Mike had contributed 6 points, 4 assists, and countless little plays that didn't show up in the stat sheet but made everyone else better. After the game, Coach Martinez explained his decision to me. He said I was a talented player, but that I'd developed habits of trying to do too much instead of trusting my teammates. He said the team was more balanced when everyone had defined roles and stuck to them, rather than 1 or 2 players trying to carry the scoring load. He offered me a choice for the rest of the season. I could accept a smaller role coming off the bench, focusing on providing energy and scoring when needed, or I could continue to start but commit to playing within the team system, even if it meant fewer individual accolades. I chose to embrace the bench role, and it ended up being the best decision I made that season. Coming off the bench, I became the guy who could change the pace of the game, provide a spark when the starters were struggling, or give key players a rest without the team losing momentum. My scoring average actually went down, but our team's wins went up. More importantly, I learned to see basketball differently. Instead of viewing success through my personal statistics, I started measuring it by how the team performed when I was on the court. I began to appreciate the players who did the unglamorous work that made everyone else look good. We ended up having our best season in years, making it to the regional finals largely because we played as a cohesive unit rather than a collection of individual talents. I contributed to that success in ways that didn't always show up on the scoreboard, but felt more meaningful than anything I'd accomplished when I was focused on my own numbers. The experience changed how I approached everything, not just basketball. In group projects at school, I stopped trying to do everything myself and started figuring out how to help my teammates contribute their best work. In my part-time job, I focused more on making my co-workers' jobs easier than on standing out to management. Coach Martinez taught me that there's a difference between being indispensable and being the center of attention. The most valuable players aren't always the ones with the best stats. They're the ones who make everyone around them better. That lesson has served me well in college, in my career, and in relationships. Years later, when I was working on team projects in my first job, I remembered that basketball season. I realized that the people who get promoted aren't always the ones who do the flashiest work. They're often the ones who help their entire team succeed. Being willing to take a smaller role for the greater good is actually a form of leadership that most people never develop. I still keep in touch with Coach Martinez, and he always asks about how I'm applying the lessons from that season to whatever I'm doing now. He says that benching me was one of the hardest coaching decisions he'd made, because he knew I had talent, but that teaching me to use that talent in service of something bigger was more important than keeping me happy in the short term. That story ends there. Coach Martinez understood something that most people in leadership positions miss, that sometimes developing character matters more than keeping your best individual performers happy. Ethan learned that being the star isn't always the same as being valuable. The best teams aren't built around one person trying to do everything. They're built around everyone doing their part really well. Let's move to a story about how the worst moments can lead to the best discoveries. The day I missed the bus. This happened during my sophomore year of college. And honestly, it started what would become the most important friendship of my life. All because I overslept and missed my usual transportation to campus. I was taking this early morning chemistry class that started at 8, which meant I had to catch the 7:30 bus from my apartment complex to make it on time. I'm not naturally a morning person, so this was already a struggle, but the class was only offered at that time, and I needed it for my major. That particular morning, my alarm didn't go off because my phone had died overnight, and I'd forgotten to plug it in. I woke up at 7:45 to sunlight streaming through my window and immediately knew I was in trouble. The bus only ran every hour during morning hours, so missing the 7:30 meant I'd be at least an hour late to a class I was already struggling in. I threw on clothes, grabbed my backpack, and ran to the bus stop anyway, hoping maybe the bus was running late or I'd somehow misread my clock. But when I got there, the stop was empty, and I could see the bus disappearing around the corner about 2 blocks ahead. I'd missed it by maybe 3 minutes. Standing at that empty bus stop, I felt like everything was going wrong at once. I was already behind in chemistry because the material was harder than I'd expected. I'd missed 2 classes earlier in the semester due to being sick, and I couldn't afford to miss another one if I wanted to keep up. I briefly considered calling an Uber, but as a broke college student, $25 for a ride to campus wasn't really an option. I decided to walk to campus instead of giving up completely. It was about a 4-mile walk, which would take me over an hour, so I'd definitely miss class. But at least I could get there in time for my next class and maybe catch my chemistry professor during office hours to explain why I'd been absent. I started walking along the route I'd seen the bus take, figuring it was probably the most direct path to campus. About 10 minutes into my walk, I heard someone call out behind me, asking if I was heading to the university. I turned around and saw a girl about my age with a backpack, clearly another student who looked like she was in the same predicament. Her name was Amy, and she'd also missed the 7:30 bus. She lived in a different apartment complex, but had been walking to the same bus stop when she saw the bus pulling away. She was also supposed to be in an 8 o'clock class, though hers was statistics rather than chemistry. We commiserated about our terrible timing and decided to walk together since we were going the same direction anyway. What started as shared misery about missing the bus turned into one of the best conversations I'd had since starting college. Amy was funny, in this dry, observational way that had me laughing despite being stressed about missing class. She was a psychology major with a minor in creative writing, and she had this way of talking about people and situations that made ordinary things seem interesting. We talked about everything during that hour-long walk. Our classes, our majors, why we'd chosen this university, what we wanted to do after graduation. Amy had this perspective on life that was different from anyone I'd met before. She was optimistic without being naive, ambitious without being competitive, and genuinely curious about other people's experiences. By the time we reached campus, I'd completely forgotten about being upset about missing chemistry. Amy had made the walk feel like it went by in 15 minutes instead of an hour. We exchanged numbers and made plans to study together since we were both taking math-heavy courses that semester. That missed bus became a weekly tradition. Amy and I would meet at the bus stop, and if we made it, great. If we missed it, we'd walk together and use the time to catch up on whatever was happening in our lives. Some of my favourite memories from college are those morning walks when we'd solve the world's problems or just laugh about ridiculous things that had happened during the week. Amy became my closest friend in college and eventually my study partner, travel companion, and the person I called whenever I needed advice about anything. She helped me get through organic chemistry, celebrated with me when I got accepted to graduate school, and was the maid of honor at my wedding 3 years ago. Looking back, missing that bus was one of the best things that happened to me in college. If I'd made it to class that morning, I probably never would have had a reason to talk to Amy, beyond maybe nodding at her if we'd ended up at the same bus stop occasionally. Our friendship grew out of that shared experience of things not going according to plan. Amy always says that the best parts of life are the things you didn't plan for, the detours that end up being more interesting than the original destination. She's right about that. Some of my most meaningful relationships and experiences have come from moments when my original plan fell through and I had to improvise. That morning taught me to be more open to unexpected opportunities instead of getting frustrated when things don't go exactly as I'd hoped. Now, when plans change or something doesn't work out the way I expected, I try to remember that morning walk with Amy and stay curious about what might happen instead. Missing the bus that day changed the entire trajectory of my college experience and probably my life. Amy introduced me to new friends, convinced me to join clubs I wouldn't have considered, and helped me see possibilities I'd never thought about. All because we were both bad at waking up early and ended up walking to campus together. That story ends there. This is such a perfect example of how life's timing works in mysterious ways. One overslept morning led to a friendship that shaped everything that came after. Makes you wonder how many amazing connections we miss because we're too focused on sticking to our plans instead of being open to what happens when those plans fall apart. Our next story is about how sometimes the biggest disasters create the sweetest memories. My sister's birthday cake. I'm Hannah, and this story is about the birthday cake that went completely wrong, but somehow became the most memorable part of my sister's sweet 16. My sister Emma was turning 16, and my mum had planned this elaborate party with all her friends from school. Emma had been looking forward to it for months, talking about her dress, the decorations, and especially the cake she'd designed with my mum. The cake was supposed to be this 3-layer masterpiece with pink and purple frosting, edible flowers, and 16 candles arranged in a heart shape. My mum had been baking for years and was really good at it, so we were all confident this was going to be the centerpiece of the whole celebration. Emma had even taken pictures of similar cakes online to show her friends what to expect. The day of the party, I was supposed to help with setup, while my mum put the finishing touches on the cake. Everything was going smoothly until about 2 hours before the party was supposed to start. My mum had finished decorating the cake, and it looked absolutely perfect, exactly like Emma had envisioned. She carefully placed it on our dining room table and covered it with a glass cake dome to protect it. That's when our cat, Mr. Whiskers, decided to have the worst timing in feline history. He jumped onto the dining room table, something he'd never done before, and somehow managed to knock the entire glass dome off the cake. The dome shattered on the floor, and worse, several pieces of glass landed directly on the beautiful frosting flowers my mum had spent hours creating. I heard the crash from the kitchen and ran into the dining room to find my mum standing there in shock, staring at what was left of Emma's dream cake. The top layer was completely covered in glass shards. The frosting was torn up from where the dome had scraped across it, and there were bits of broken glass scattered everywhere. It was a complete disaster. My mum started crying, not just because of the ruined cake, but because she knew how much Emma had been looking forward to this specific cake. There wasn't time to make another one from scratch, and even if there had been, we didn't have enough ingredients for 3 more layers. The party guests were going to arrive in 2 hours, expecting this elaborate celebration, and now we had nothing to serve for dessert. Emma came downstairs to see what the noise had been and found both of us standing around the wreckage of her birthday cake. I expected her to be devastated, maybe even want to cancel the party. Instead, she started laughing. Not the kind of laughter that covers up disappointment, but genuine, belly-deep laughter that made both my mum and me stare at her like she'd lost her mind. Through her laughter, Emma said that Mr. Whiskers had just given her the most unique 16th birthday story anyone in her class would ever have. She said none of her friends would ever forget the party where the cat destroyed the cake, and that was actually way more memorable than having a perfect cake that looked like everyone else's. My mum was still upset about all the work that had gone to waste, but Emma insisted we could figure out something else. She suggested we drive to the grocery store and buy whatever random cakes they had available, then combine them into something ridiculous instead of trying to recreate what we'd lost. We ended up buying 3 completely different cakes from the grocery store bakery: a chocolate sheet cake with sports decorations, a small vanilla cake with cartoon characters, and a strawberry cake that was shaped like a flower. Emma thought it was hilarious that her 16th birthday cake turned out to be a Frankenstein creation of 3 random cakes that had nothing to do with each other. When her friends arrived for the party, Emma immediately told them the story of Mr. Whiskers and the great cake disaster of her 16th birthday. Instead of being disappointed, everyone thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. The mismatched cakes became a conversation starter, and people were taking pictures with the ridiculous dessert table all night. But the best part happened when we were cleaning up after the party. Emma found me in the kitchen and thanked me for helping save her birthday. She said that watching how my mum and I had handled the crisis had made her realise that problems aren't really problems if you have people who care enough to help you solve them. She said the original cake would have been beautiful and perfect, but it wouldn't have taught her anything or created a story worth telling. The disaster had shown her that the people at her party cared more about celebrating her than about having Instagram-worthy decorations. Years later, Emma still brings up the cat cake disaster whenever she's dealing with something that doesn't go according to plan. She'll text me pictures of whatever's gone wrong with the caption, "Remember Mr. Whiskers?" and the cake. It's become our family shorthand for rolling with the punches and finding the humour in situations that seem terrible at first. My mum eventually admitted that Emma's reaction to the ruined cake taught her something important about perfectionism and expectations. She said watching Emma choose laughter over disappointment had been more meaningful than any perfectly executed party could have been. Emma's now 28 and getting married next year, and she's already joked that she hopes something goes hilariously wrong at her wedding so she'll have a good story to tell. She says perfect events are forgettable, but disasters with the right people become legendary family stories. That birthday taught all of us that flexibility and humour can turn the worst moments into the best memories. Sometimes, the things that go wrong end up being the things that go most right, especially when you're surrounded by people who help you laugh instead of letting you panic. That story ends there. Emma had the kind of attitude that turns disasters into adventures, and honestly, she's probably right that nobody remembers perfect parties, but everyone remembers the ones where something hilariously unexpected happened. Mr. Whiskers accidentally gave her the gift of perspective, which is way more valuable than any cake could ever be. Let's move to our next story about discovering that kindness from strangers can restore your faith in humanity when you need it most. The stranger who returned my phone. This happened about 2 years ago, during what was already shaping up to be one of the most stressful weeks of my life, and it completely changed how I think about trusting people I don't know. I was in my final semester of college, dealing with job interviews, thesis deadlines, and all the anxiety that comes with trying to figure out what you're going to do after graduation. My phone had become basically essential to my survival because it contained my calendar, my thesis research, contact information for potential employers, and pretty much my entire life organised into various apps. That Tuesday morning, I had back-to-back classes, followed by a job interview downtown that I'd been preparing for weeks. The interview was for a position at a company I really wanted to work for, and I'd spent hours researching the organisation and practicing answers to potential questions. Everything was going according to plan until I got on the city bus to head to the interview. The bus was more crowded than usual, and I was standing in the aisle holding onto one of the support poles while trying to review my notes one more time on my phone. About halfway to my stop, the bus hit a pothole hard enough to make everyone stumble a little bit. I managed to keep my balance, but I must have loosened my grip on my phone because when I reached for it a few minutes later to check the time, it was gone. I immediately started looking around on the floor, checking my pockets again, asking the people sitting near where I'd been standing if they'd seen anything. Nothing. My phone had either fallen out of my hand when the bus lurched and gotten kicked under a seat, or someone had picked it up and decided to keep it. Either way, it was gone, and I was about to walk into the most important job interview of my life without any of the information I'd stored on my phone. I got off at my stop feeling completely frazzled. I tried to remember the exact address of the company from memory, but I'd been relying on my phone's GPS to get me there. I ended up having to ask 3 different people for directions and showed up to the interview 15 minutes late and visibly stressed. The interview didn't go well. I kept thinking about my missing phone and all the information I'd lost, which made it hard to focus on answering questions thoughtfully. I stumbled through responses that I'd practiced perfectly the night before, and I could tell the interviewer noticed that something was off. I left knowing I'd probably blown my chance at a job I really wanted, all because I'd been careless with my phone on a city bus. The rest of that day was spent trying to figure out how to replace everything I had lost. I called my phone company to report it stolen, started the process of backing up what I could from my cloud storage, and began the tedious task of trying to remember all the phone numbers and appointments I had saved. It felt overwhelming on top of everything else I was dealing with that week. That evening I was sitting in my apartment, feeling sorry for myself when I got a call on my landline, which barely anyone ever used. The voice on the other end was an older woman who said she'd found my phone on a city bus and had been trying to figure out how to return it to me. She explained that she'd been sitting near where I was standing and had seen my phone slide under her seat when the bus hit that pothole. She'd picked it up but hadn't been able to get my attention before I got off the bus. She said she'd spent the afternoon trying to figure out how to contact me, eventually realising she could call my emergency contact number that I had displayed on my lock screen. The woman, who said her name was Mrs. Patterson, offered to meet me somewhere to return the phone. I suggested a coffee shop near my apartment, and she agreed to meet me there the next morning before she went to work. She sounded genuinely pleased that she'd been able to track me down and seemed excited about reuniting me with my phone. When I met Mrs. Patterson the next morning, she handed me my phone with this huge smile on her face, like she was returning a lost child to its parents. She'd even put it in a protective case from her purse to make sure the screen didn't get scratched while she was carrying it around. She refused my offer to buy her coffee or give her money for her trouble, saying she was just happy to help. Mrs. Patterson told me she'd been in similar situations before and knew how stressful it was to lose something so important. She said she had a son about my age and hoped that if he ever lost something valuable, a stranger would take the time to help him get it back. She wished me luck with my job search and said she hoped things worked out well for me. I got back to my apartment and immediately called the company, where I'd had the terrible interview, to ask if I could have a second chance, explaining that I'd been distracted by losing my phone, but was genuinely interested in the position. The HR representative was understanding and agreed to let me come in for another interview the following week. The second interview went completely differently. I was calm, prepared, and able to focus on demonstrating why I'd be a good fit for the company. I ended up getting the job, and I've been working there for almost 2 years now. None of that would have happened if Mrs. Patterson hadn't taken the time to track me down and return my phone. But the impact went beyond just getting my phone back, or even getting the job. Mrs. Patterson's kindness came at a moment when I was feeling really cynical about people and stressed about whether things would work out after graduation. Her willingness to spend her own time helping a stranger reminded me that most people are good and that reaching out for help or giving help when you can is what makes communities work. Since then, I've tried to be more like Mrs. Patterson when opportunities arise. I've returned wallets I've found on the street, helped tourists who looked lost, and made an effort to be the kind of person who helps rather than walks by when someone needs assistance. Her example taught me that small acts of decency can have enormous impacts on someone's day or even their life trajectory. I still have Mrs. Patterson's phone number saved in my contacts, and I send her a Christmas card every year to let her know how things are going and to thank her again for what she did. She always writes back with updates about her family and encouragement about whatever challenges I'm facing. That chance encounter on a stressful day turned into an ongoing connection that I treasure. Mrs. Patterson taught me that trustworthiness still exists in the world, even when your faith in people is running low. Sometimes the kindness of a stranger can restore your optimism about humanity at exactly the moment when you need it most. That story ends there. Mrs. Patterson could have easily kept that phone or turned it into the bus company and been done with it, but instead she went out of her way to reunite it with its owner. Her kindness didn't just return a lost item, it restored someone's faith in people at exactly the right moment. Those ripple effects are still spreading years later. Let's move to a story about how, sometimes, the people who doubt you end up providing the best motivation. The teacher who said I'd fail. I'm James, and this story is about Mr. Henderson and the conversation that lit a fire under me that's still burning 15 years later. Mr. Henderson was my high school guidance counsellor, and he had this way of talking to students that made it clear he thought most of us wouldn't amount to much after graduation. I was a decent student, not exceptional but not failing either, somewhere in that middle range where you can easily slip through the cracks if nobody's paying attention. My grades were mostly B's and C's. I played JV baseball, but wasn't good enough for varsity, and I didn't have any particular talents that made teachers remember my name after the semester ended. During my junior year, we had these mandatory meetings with guidance counsellors to discuss post-graduation plans. Most of my friends dreaded these meetings because Mr. Henderson had a reputation for being brutally honest about students' prospects, which usually translated to him crushing whatever dreams didn't fit his narrow definition of realistic. When my turn came, I sat down in his cramped office surrounded by college brochures and motivational posters that felt ironic given his pessimistic attitude toward most students. He looked at my transcript for maybe 30 seconds before asking what I planned to do after high school. I told him I was thinking about going to college and maybe studying business or communications. I hadn't decided on a specific career path yet, but I figured college would help me figure that out while giving me more opportunities than just entering the workforce with a high school diploma. Mr. Henderson set down my transcript and gave me this look like I'd just told him I planned to become an astronaut or a professional athlete. He said that based on my grades and test scores, college wasn't a realistic option for someone like me. He suggested I look into trade schools or community college programs that would prepare me for practical jobs. When I pushed back and said I thought I could handle college coursework if I applied myself, Mr. Henderson got more direct. He said I was being unrealistic about my abilities and that students like me who went to four-year colleges usually ended up dropping out with student loan debt and wasted time they could have spent learning useful skills. Then he said something that I'll never forget as long as I live. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "James, you're not college material. You never have been, and pretending otherwise is just going to lead to disappointment. Some people are meant for higher education, and some people aren't. There's nothing wrong with accepting which category you fall into." I left that meeting feeling crushed and angry at the same time. Part of me wondered if he was right, if I was deluding myself about my potential, and should just accept that college wasn't for people like me. But a bigger part of me was furious that someone in a position to help students had basically told me to give up on my goals before I'd even tried to achieve them. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. I decided that Mr. Henderson was going to be wrong about me, and I was going to prove it not just to him but to myself. If he thought I wasn't college material, then becoming successful in college was going to be my first priority. I spent the rest of my junior year and all of senior year working harder than I'd ever worked in school. I stayed after class to ask teachers for extra help, formed study groups with students who were getting better grades than me, and actually read the assigned books instead of just skimming them the night before tests. My grades improved dramatically. I brought my GPA up from a 2.8 to a 3.4 by graduation, scored higher on the SAT than Mr. Henderson had predicted, and got accepted to 3 different state universities. When I had to meet with him one final time to submit my college applications, I made sure to mention that I'd been accepted and would be attending the university he'd said was out of my reach. College was challenging, but I was prepared for that. Mr. Henderson's prediction that I'd drop out became motivation every time I felt overwhelmed by coursework or homesick. I'd remember his certainty that I'd fail, and it would give me the energy to push through whatever difficulty I was facing. I graduated with a degree in business administration with a 3.6 GPA, made the Dean's List 3 semesters, and got a job at a consulting firm before graduation. But I wasn't done proving Mr. Henderson wrong yet. I went back to school part-time for my MBA while working full-time because I wanted to show myself that I could succeed at an even higher level of education. 5 years after graduating from college, I was promoted to a management position at my company. 10 years after graduation, I was running my own consulting business. 15 years later, I employ 12 people and have built something I'm genuinely proud of from the ground up. Last year, I was invited back to my high school to speak at a career day event for current students. Mr. Henderson was still working there, though he was close to retirement. After my presentation, he approached me and said he remembered me and was impressed by what I'd accomplished. I thanked him for his role in my success, which seemed to confuse him. I explained that his prediction that I'd fail had been the best motivation I'd ever received. He'd taught me that other people's limitations don't have to become my limitations, and that sometimes the people who doubt you end up doing you the biggest favour. Mr. Henderson seemed uncomfortable with this interpretation, but I meant it sincerely. His lack of faith in my potential had forced me to develop faith in myself. His certainty that I'd fail had made success feel like the most important thing I could achieve. Now when I'm hiring people for my company, I pay attention to candidates who've had to overcome others' low expectations. Those are often the people with the strongest work ethic and the most determination to prove themselves. Being underestimated can be a powerful motivator if you channel it correctly. This next story comes from someone who learned that generosity has nothing to do with how much you have, and everything to do with who you choose to be. I forgot my lunch at school, and it was one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong from the moment I woke up. I'd overslept, rushed through getting ready, and in my hurry to catch the bus, I left my lunch sitting on the kitchen counter. By the time lunch period rolled around, I was starving and had exactly $0 in my pocket. I sat at my usual table trying to pretend I wasn't hungry while watching everyone else eat. That's when this kid from my math class, someone I'd maybe spoken to twice in my pulled out his lunch, which was just a simple, entire life, came over and sat down across from me. Peanut butter and jelly sandwich wrapped in aluminum of those quiet kids who kept to himself most of the time. His name was David, and he was one of those quiet kids who never caused trouble. His lunch was simple, nothing fancy, half a sandwich wrapped in foil, an apple, and a small bag of chips. It probably cost his family less than $3 to make. Without saying a word, he carefully split his sandwich in half and slid one piece across the table to me. "You forgot yours, right?" he said simply, shrugging. I tried to refuse, telling him he didn't need to share, but he just pushed it toward me again and added half his chips too. We sat there eating in comfortable silence, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I remember thinking about how David's family didn't have much money. His clothes were always clean, but clearly hand-me-downs, and he never bought anything from the school vending machines or the cafeteria. Yet here he was, sharing what little he had with someone who was basically a stranger. That simple act of kindness stuck with me in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't about making me feel bad for forgetting my lunch, and it wasn't about him wanting credit. There was no expectation of gratitude. He just saw someone who needed something and gave what he could. The next day, I tried to pay him back by bringing an extra granola bar for him. He smiled and said, "Pass it along to someone else who might need it." That became our quiet thing for the rest of the school year. We would nod to each other in the hallways and sometimes share a table at lunch, but we never became best friends or anything dramatic. Years later, when I was in college and struggling to make ends meet, I found myself in a campus dining hall, watching a clearly hungry student count coins, trying to figure out if he had enough for a meal. Without hesitation, I bought him lunch and sat with him while he ate. When he tried to thank me, I just repeated what David had taught me. Pass it along to someone else who might need it. I never saw David after high school, but that one lunch taught me something that has shaped how I move through the world. Generosity isn't about having excess to give away. It's about recognizing that we all struggle sometimes and choosing to help when we can, even if what we can offer feels small. That story ends there. It's incredible how one kid's willingness to share half a sandwich created a ripple effect that lasted years. David didn't have much, but he understood something that a lot of adults never figure out. Kindness doesn't require wealth, just the recognition that we're all in this together. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the quietest moments. Let's move to our next story, which comes from someone who learned the hard way that we often don't appreciate what we have until it's gone. My best friend Kelly moved away when we were both 12, and I thought my world was ending. We had been inseparable since kindergarten, the kind of friendship where we finished each other's sentences and could communicate with just a look across the classroom. Kelly lived 3 houses down from me, and we spent every possible moment together. We'd walk to school side by side, spend weekends having sleepovers, and during summer breaks, we'd practically live at each other's houses. We had this elaborate plan for high school, college, and even being each other's maid of honor someday. When Kelly told me her dad got a job transfer and they'd be moving across the country, I refused to believe it at first. It felt impossible that something so fundamental to my daily life could just disappear. We spent her last few weeks making promises about staying in touch, writing letters, and visiting each other during holidays. The day she left, I stood in my bedroom window watching the moving truck pull away from her house. I cried harder than I'd ever cried about anything, and my mum found me there hours later, still staring at Kelly's empty bedroom window across the way. What I didn't expect was how the loss would change me. In the weeks after Kelly left, I found myself paying attention to my other friendships in a completely different way. I started noticing when my friend Sarah made jokes that only I would understand, or when my neighbour Emma saved me a seat at lunch without being asked. I began to really listen when my mum told me about her day. Instead of just waiting for my turn to talk, I started appreciating the routine conversations with classmates that I'd previously considered boring small talk. Even arguments with my little brother felt precious because at least he was still there to argue with. Kelly and I did stay in touch for a while, but as we got older and our lives took different paths, the letters became less frequent and the phone calls grew shorter. It wasn't anyone's fault, it was just the natural way these things happen when you're building separate lives in different places. But losing her taught me something invaluable about presence and attention. I learned to value the ordinary moments with people I care about, instead of always waiting for special occasions or dramatic events to show them I appreciate them. Now, when I'm having dinner with friends, I try to really be there instead of thinking about what I need to do later. When my mum calls just to chat, I give her my full attention instead of multitasking. When someone I care about is going through a hard time, I make sure they know I'm available, not just with words but with actions. Kelly taught me that every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of understanding between people is temporary and precious. She showed me that friendship isn't just about the big moments or the dramatic gestures, but about showing up consistently and paying attention while you have the chance. I'm grateful for the friendship we had, even though it ended earlier than I wanted it to. And I'm grateful for the lesson it taught me about not taking the people in my life for granted. Some of my closest relationships now are stronger because I learned from Kelly that presence is a gift we give each other, and we never know how long we'll have the opportunity to give it. That story is over. The pain of losing Kelly taught her something beautiful about cherishing what's right in front of us. It's one of those lessons that sounds obvious until you actually learn it the hard way. We spend so much time planning for future moments with people that we forget to fully experience the present ones. Sometimes loss is the teacher that shows us how to love better while we still can. Our next story comes from Marcus, who discovered that helping strangers isn't just about the immediate problem you solve. It's about the chain reaction of kindness you set home from work on in motion. I was driving a Friday evening when I heard that unmistakable sound of a tyre going flat. I pulled over to the side of a busy highway, and as I got out to assess the damage, I realised I was in a pretty bad spot. It was getting dark, traffic was heavy, and I was on a stretch of road with no businesses nearby. I'd changed a tyre before, but never on a highway with cars flying past at 60 miles per hour. I was trying to work up the courage to get started when an older pickup truck pulled up behind me. A man in his 60s got out, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, and walked over to me. "Looks like you could use some help," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. I tried to tell him I could handle it, but he was already kneeling down to examine my flat tyre. He introduced himself as Frank and told me to just stay back and keep an eye out for traffic while he worked. Within 15 minutes, he had my tyre changed and was loading my flat into my trunk. When I tried to give him money for his time, Frank shook his head and said, "Just pass it along to someone else who needs help." That's how back in his truck, and drove away before this works. He got so I could even properly thank him. I stood there for a moment, watching his taillights disappear into traffic, feeling overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. 2 months later, I was at a gas station when I saw a woman standing next to her car, looking frustrated and confused. Her hood was up, and she was staring at her engine like it held the secrets of the universe. I walked over and asked if she needed help. Turns out her battery had died, and she didn't have jumper cables. I happened to have a set in my trunk, so I pulled my car around and got her started. When she tried to pay me, I heard Frank's words coming out of my mouth. "Just pass it along to someone else who needs help." That became my philosophy. Over the next few years, I helped people with flat tyres, dead batteries, and various car troubles. I gave directions to lost tourists, carried groceries for elderly neighbours, and lent tools to people working on home projects. Nothing dramatic, just small acts of helpfulness when opportunities presented themselves. But what surprised me was how often people would tell me about paying it forward. The woman with the dead battery sent me a message months later, telling me she'd helped a family whose car had broken down during a rainstorm. A neighbour I'd helped move furniture told me he'd started volunteering at a local food bank because helping me had reminded him how good it felt to be useful to others. I began to see that Frank hadn't just helped me change a tyre that day. He'd introduced me to a way of moving through the world that created connections and opportunities for kindness everywhere I went. When you're looking for ways to help people, you start noticing all the small struggles that usually go invisible. The teenager at the grocery store who's clearly counting change, hoping they have enough. The elderly person struggling to reach something on a high shelf. The parent juggling a crying baby, a toddler, and a cart full of groceries. Once you start paying attention, you realise how many opportunities there are to make someone's day a little easier. Frank's simple act of highway assistance taught me that kindness is contagious in the best possible way. Every time you help someone, you're not just solving their immediate problem, you're showing them what's possible when people care about each other. And often that lesson gets passed along to the next person they encounter who needs help. I never saw Frank again, but I think about him every time I stop to help someone. He gave me more than roadside assistance that day. He gave me a blueprint for how to be a better human being, one small act of service at a time. That story wraps up there. Marcus learned something powerful about the ripple effects of kindness from a stranger who refused payment for changing a tire. Frank understood that helping others isn't a transaction, it's a movement. When you help someone without expecting anything in return, you're not just solving their problem, you're teaching them how to solve someone else's problem down the road. It's like planting seeds of generosity that bloom in ways you'll never see. Our failure isn't the opposite of success. Next story comes from someone who learned that it's just another step toward it. I was 11 years old when I entered the school spelling bee, absolutely convinced I was going to win. I had been the best speller in my class for 3 years running, and I spent weeks preparing for the competition. I made flashcards, studied word origins, and practiced with my mum every night after dinner. The day of the spelling bee, I felt confident and ready. I sailed through the first few rounds without breaking a sweat. Words like necessary and separate that stumped other kids were easy for me. I could see my parents in the audience, beaming with pride, and I started mentally planning what I'd say in my victory speech. Then came the word that changed everything. Accommodate. The judge spoke it clearly, used it in a sentence, and waited for me to spell it. I was so confident that I didn't even pause to think about it. I rattled off the letters quickly. Accommodate. The buzzer sounded immediately. I'd left out one of the double letters, and just like that, I was out. Third place in a competition I'd been certain I would win. I walked off that stage feeling like everyone was staring at me, like my failure was written across my forehead in permanent marker. I cried in the bathroom afterward, not because I'd lost, but because I'd been so overconfident. I realised I hadn't actually studied as I had. I'd gotten hard as I thought comfortable being the best in my class, and assumed that would be enough for the whole school competition. My mum found me in the bathroom and sat with me while I cried. She didn't try to make me feel better with empty reassurances. Instead, she said something that stuck with me. Now you know what you need to work on. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I went home that day and looked up every word I'd missed in previous spelling bees. I started reading more challenging books and keeping a vocabulary journal. When the next year's spelling bee came around, I was prepared in a completely different way. Not just confident, but actually ready. I didn't win that year either, but I came in second. And more importantly, I felt proud of the work I'd put in. I'd learned that preparation and effort matter more than natural ability or past success. That losing can teach you more than winning ever will, if you're willing to listen to what it's trying to tell you. Years later, when I was in college struggling with organic chemistry, I remembered that spelling bee. Instead of giving up or making excuses, I went to office hours, formed study groups, and worked harder than I had ever worked on anything. I ended up with an A in that class, but the grade wasn't the real victory. The real victory was learning that failure doesn't define you unless you let it. That 11-year-old who misspelled accommodate taught me that confidence without preparation is just wishful thinking. She taught me that the sting of failure fades, but the lessons it teaches can last a lifetime if you're brave enough to learn from them. That story concludes there. Sometimes the losses that hurt the most are the ones that teach us the most. Getting knocked down when you least expect it can be brutal, but it's also often the wake-up call that pushes you to actually grow. That spelling bee failure probably did more for their character than winning ever could have. Let's move to our next story, which completely changed a student's trajectory, shows how one teaches patience. I was terrible at math, not just struggling, but genuinely convinced that numbers were my enemy and that my brain simply wasn't wired for mathematical thinking. By 8th grade, I was barely passing algebra, and I'd started to accept that I was just going to be one of those people who isn't good at math. My teacher, and she was different that year, was Mrs. Rodriguez from any math teacher I'd had before. Instead of rushing through lessons or making students feel stupid for not understanding, she had this way of breaking down problems that made them feel manageable. But even with her patient teaching style, I was still drowning. About halfway through the semester, I failed a major test spectacularly. We're talking a 38% kind of failure. I was mortified and ready to accept that I should probably just focus on English and history, subjects that came more naturally to me. After class that day, Mrs. Rodriguez asked me to stay behind. I figured she was going to suggest I drop down to a lower level math class, or maybe recommend tutoring that my parents couldn't afford. Instead, she pulled out my test and said, "I can see exactly where you're getting confused. Would you like me to show you?" She didn't make it sound like charity or like I was hopeless. She made it sound like she had something interesting to share with me, like solving my confusion would be as satisfying for her as it would be helpful for me. For the next hour, Mrs. Rodriguez walked me through every problem I'd missed, not just showing me the right answers, but explaining why the wrong answers didn't work and helping me see the patterns I'd been missing. She used different approaches until she found ones that clicked with how my brain processed information. When we finished, she said something that changed everything. "You're not bad at math. You just needed someone to explain it in a way that makes sense to you. Come back tomorrow after school and we'll keep working on this." I showed up the next day and the day after that. Mrs. Rodriguez stayed after school with me 3 days a week for the rest of the semester, never making me feel like I was taking up her time or that my questions were stupid. She celebrated small victories with me, like when I finally understood how to factor polynomials or when I solved a word problem without help. My grades started improving, but more importantly, my relationship with learning changed. I stopped seeing confusion as evidence that I wasn't smart enough and started seeing it as information about what I needed to work on. I learned that asking for help wasn't admitting defeat. It was taking responsibility for my education. By the end of 8th grade, I was getting B's in math. In high school, I took calculus. In college, I majored in engineering. None of that would have happened without Mrs. Rodriguez's willingness to stay after school and believe that I could learn even when I didn't believe it myself. Years later, when I graduated from college, I sent Mrs. Rodriguez a photo of me in my cap and gown with a note thanking her for changing the trajectory of my entire life. She wrote back saying she knew I had it in me all along. I just needed someone to help me find it. That one teacher's patience and dedication didn't just help me pass algebra. It taught me that struggling with something doesn't mean you're incapable of mastering it. It taught me that the right kind of help at the right time can completely change believing in people. What's possible for someone. It taught me that, especially when they don't believe in themselves, is one of Mrs. Rodriguez showed me that learning isn't about being naturally the most powerful things you can do. Gifted. It's about finding the right approach, putting in the work, and having someone in that story ends there. Mrs. Rodriguez understood something profound about teaching that goes way beyond subject matter. She knew that confidence and capability can be built, not just discovered. That teacher didn't just explain algebra differently. She showed that struggling student what it felt like to have someone genuinely believe in their potential. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stay after school and say, "You can do this," until you start believing it yourself. Our next story, Until You Start, comes from someone who learned that friendship isn't about the good times. It's about who shows up when you can't. I broke my arm on the 3rd day of summer vacation when I was 13, and I was absolutely devastated. It wasn't just a simple fracture either. It was a compound break me in a cast from that required surgery and left my hand to my shoulder. My entire summer was supposed to be filled with swimming, basketball and riding bikes with my friends. Instead, I was stuck inside, unable to do any of the activities I'd been looking forward to for months. The first few days after the accident were the worst. I felt sorry for myself and convinced that my summer was completely ruined. I couldn't swim, couldn't play sports, couldn't even ride my bike properly. I figured my friends would go on with their summer plans without me, and I'd spend the next 2 months watching television and feeling unexpected happened. On miserable. But something the 4th day, my friend Jake showed up at my door with a deck of cards and said he wanted to teach me a new game. We spent the afternoon playing cards and just talking, something we'd never really done before because we were usually too busy being active. The next day, my friend Emma came over with art supplies. She said she'd always wanted to try drawing but never had time during the school year. We spent hours sketching and painting, and I discovered I was actually pretty good at it. Something I never would have learned if I hadn't been forced to sit still. Throughout that summer, my friends took turns coming over. Sometimes they came alone, sometimes in small groups. They brought board games, books, movies, and conversations I never would have had if we had just been running around playing sports all day. I learned things about my friends that I had never known despite years of friendship. Jake told me about how nervous he got before every basketball game, something I never would have guessed because he always seemed so confident on the court. Emma shared that she wanted to be an artist someday, but was afraid her parents would think it wasn't a practical career choice. My friend Connor admitted that he sometimes felt left out of our group because he wasn't as athletic as the rest of us. What struck me most was that none of my friends treated my broken arm like an inconvenience or acted like spending time with me was boring because we couldn't do our usual activities. They adjusted their summer plans to include me, finding new ways for us to hang out that worked with my limitations. By the middle of the summer, I realised I was actually having more meaningful friendships than I'd ever had before. When you can't fill time with constant activity, you have to actually talk to each other, share ideas, and connect on a deeper level. My broken arm had forced us all to slow down and really get to know each other. When my cast finally came off at the end of August, I was excited to get back to normal activities, but I was also sad to lose the intimate conversations and quiet time we'd been sharing. I'd learned something important about friendship that summer. Real friends don't just show up for the fun activities, they show up when you need them, even if it means changing their own plans. That broken arm taught me to pay attention to who's there for you when things aren't going according to plan. It taught me that the friends worth keeping are the ones who will sit with you in your living room, playing cards when adventures. It taught me that sometimes they could be out. Having the things that seem like disasters at first can parts of the actually reveal the best people around you. Years later, I'm still close with Jake, Emma and Connor. We've all been there for each other through various challenges. And I think that summer, when I broke my arm, set friendships. It showed us the foundation for those lasting all what it meant to really show up for each other. Not just when it was convenient, but when it mattered most. That story wraps up there. There's something beautiful about how a broken bone can lead to stronger friendships. When you're forced to slow down and can't do your usual activities, you find out who's willing to slow down with you. True friendship isn't about sharing adventures, it's about sharing presence. Those kids who chose card games over swimming pools and art supplies over bike rides showed what loyalty really looks like. Let's move to our next story, which comes from someone who found unexpected wisdom in the simplest conversation. I was walking through the park on one of those afternoons where nothing seemed particularly urgent, when I noticed this elderly man sitting on a bench feeding pigeons from a paper bag. He was probably in his 80s, wearing a worn cardigan and a baseball cap that had seen better days. Something about the way he sat there, completely content with this simple routine, made me curious. I'd been having one of those weeks where everything felt overwhelming. Work was stressful, I was behind on bills, and I'd been spending way too much time scrolling through social media, feeling like everyone else had their life figured out while I was just stumbling through mine. I was walking through the park trying to clear my head, but my mind kept spinning with all the things I needed to do and all the ways I felt like I was falling short. For some reason, I found myself slowing down as I passed his bench. Maybe it was the peaceful way he was sitting there, or maybe I was just desperate for any excuse to avoid going home to my pile of responsibilities. He looked up and smiled, the kind of genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. "Beautiful afternoon," he said, gesturing to the empty space beside him on the bench. "Care to join an old man and his feathered friends?" I sat down, watching as he continued tossing small pieces of bread to the pigeons that had gathered around his feet. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "You know," he said, still looking at the birds, "I've been coming to this bench for about 15 years now, ever since my wife passed away. At first, I came here because I didn't know what else to do with myself. 53 years of marriage, and suddenly I was eating dinner alone and watching television by myself. He paused to throw another handful of breadcrumbs, and a particularly bold pigeon hopped right up to his shoe. But somewhere along the way, I started really paying attention to what was happening around me. The way the light changes throughout the day, how the seasons affect which birds show up, the different people who walk through here and the stories you can read on their faces. I found myself really listening to him, something I hadn't done with anyone in weeks. Usually, when people talked, I was already thinking about what I was going to say next, or checking my phone, or worrying about something else entirely. I realized something important sitting on this bench, he continued. Every single day has something worth noticing if you're willing to slow down enough to see it. Could be something as simple as watching a squirrel figure out how to get into a trash can, or as profound as witnessing a moment of kindness between strangers. He turned to look at me then, and I felt like he could see right through all my stress and anxiety to something deeper. Most people spend so much time thinking about yesterday or worrying about tomorrow that they miss what's happening right now. But right now is all we really have. This conversation, this afternoon, this moment when the light is hitting the trees just so. It's all temporary, but that doesn't make it less valuable. It makes it more valuable. We everything and nothing. He told me about his talk for another hour about career as a high school history teacher, about travelling with his wife, about learning to cook for himself after she died. I found myself sharing things I hadn't talked about with anyone, about feeling lost in my 20s and not sure if I was making the right choices. When I finally got up to leave, he shook my hand and said, "Remember, every day is worth something. The trick is figuring out what that something is." I walked home that day feeling different, like someone had adjusted the lens through which I saw the world. Instead of rushing past everything on my way home, I actually looked around. I noticed the way the evening light was making the leaves glow, heard a kid laughing in someone's backyard, saw an elderly couple walking their dog and holding hands. Over the next few months, I started incorporating small moments of attention into my daily life. I'd spend 5 minutes in the morning just looking out my window before checking my phone. I'd actually taste my coffee instead of just drinking it while thinking about work. I'd have real conversations with people instead of just exchanging pleasantries. That conversation with a stranger on a park bench taught me that wisdom doesn't always come from books or experts or dramatic life events. Sometimes it comes from someone who's learned to find meaning in the ordinary moments that most of us rush past without noticing. I never saw that man again, though I walked through that park many times hoping to find him there. But his words stayed with me and continue to remind me that every day offers something worth paying attention to if you're willing to slow down enough to receive it. That story ends there. There's something profound about finding life wisdom in the most unexpected places. A random conversation with a stranger feeding pigeons became a masterclass in mindfulness and presence. Sometimes, the people who seem to have the least going on are actually the ones who understand life the most deeply. Our next story comes from someone who learned that loyalty and that love can come from the most unlikely sources. Doesn't always need words to be understood. There was this stray dog that showed up at our school bus stop when I was in 4th grade. Nobody knew where he came from, but every morning at 7:30 sharp, he'd be sitting there, wagging his tail as we waited for the bus. He was a medium-sized mutt, brown and white, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down, and the friendliest disposition you could imagine. The kids in our neighbourhood started calling him Buster, though nobody knew if that was actually his name. He never had a collar, and he looks like he'd been on his own for a while. His coat was a little matted, and you could see his ribs, but his eyes were bright, and his tail never stopped wagging when he saw us coming. Buster made it his job to greet every single kid who came to that bus stop. He'd go from child to child, getting pets and scratches behind the ears, sometimes sitting patiently next to the younger kids who were nervous about starting their school day. He had this intuitive way of knowing who needed extra attention, always gravitating toward whoever seemed sad or scared. The amazing thing was that Buster was there every single day, regardless of weather. Rain, snow, blazing heat, didn't matter. He'd be sitting in his usual spot by the mailbox, waiting for his morning routine of saying goodbye to all the neighbourhood kids. When the bus pulled up, he'd watch us climb aboard, tail wagging the whole time, and then settle in to wait for us to come back in the afternoon. And he was always there when we returned. 3:15 every day, Buster would be waiting at that bus stop, ready to welcome us home from school. He'd run up and down the line of kids getting off the bus, like he was taking attendance, to make sure everyone made it back safely. Some parents started leaving food and water bowls by the bus stop, and a few families tried to coax Buster into their yards or homes. But he seemed committed to his role as the official bus stop greeter. He'd accept food and affection, but he always returned to his post by that mailbox, like he had an important job to do. This went on for about 6 months. Buster became such a fixture in our daily routine that we couldn't imagine the bus stop without him. He was like the neighbourhood mascot, bringing joy to the start and end of every school day. Even the bus driver, Mrs. Patterson, would honk her horn when she saw him, and Buster would bark back like he was saying good morning. Then one Monday morning, Buster wasn't there. We all stood around looking for him, expecting him to come trotting around the corner at any moment. But the bus came and went, and no Buster. Tuesday, same thing. By Wednesday, we were genuinely worried. Some kids started walking around the neighbourhood after school, calling his name and asking neighbours if they'd seen him. On Thursday, my friend Katie came running up to the bus stop with huge news. Her family had been driving past the animal shelter over the weekend and had seen a familiar brown and white face through the window. A family had adopted Buster just days before. Katie's mum had gone inside and talked to the shelter workers, who told her that someone had found Buster wandering the streets and brought him in. Within 2 days, a family with young children had fallen in love with him and taken him home. The shelter workers said he was clearly a special dog, friendly and gentle and perfectly suited for life with kids. We were all happy for Buster, of course, but the bus stop felt different without him. Quieter, less magical somehow. We'd gotten so used to starting and ending our school days with his enthusiastic greeting that his absence left a real void in our routine. But what stayed with me wasn't the sadness of losing Buster. It was the lesson he taught us about showing up for people, even when nobody asks you to. For 6 months, this dog had made it his responsibility to brighten the days of a bunch of kids he didn't even belong to. He'd committed himself to being a positive presence in our lives, asking for nothing in return except the occasional scratch behind the ears. Buster showed me that loyalty and love don't require ownership or obligation. They just require the decision to care about someone else's well-being and the commitment to act on that caring day after day, regardless of circumstances. Years later, whenever I'm tempted to skip doing something kind because it's inconvenient or because nobody would notice if I didn't do it, I think about Buster at that bus stop. He taught me that the most meaningful relationships aren't always the ones that are officially recognised or documented. Sometimes they're just about choosing to show up for people when they need you, consistently and without fanfare. That story comes to a close there. Buster understood something about community that most humans struggle with. He didn't need to belong to anyone to care about everyone. That dog created joy and stability in those kids' lives just by deciding their happiness mattered to him. Sometimes the most powerful acts of service come from those who have nothing to gain and everything to give. Let's move to our next story, which shows that perseverance isn't always glamorous, but it's always worth it. I failed my driving test twice, and each time felt more humiliating than the last. The first time, I was 16 and had been practicing for months with my dad in empty parking lots and quiet neighbourhood streets. I thought I was ready, maybe even overconfident about how smooth the whole process would be. That first test was a disaster from the moment I started the car. I was so nervous that my hands were shaking, and I could barely remember which pedal was which. I rolled through a stop sign, forgot to signal when changing lanes, and when the instructor asked me to parallel park, I somehow ended up with the car at a 45-degree angle to the curb with the back wheel up on the sidewalk. The instructor was polite but firm when he told me I hadn't passed. He handed me a paper listing all the things I'd done wrong, and there were a lot of them. I felt my face burning with embarrassment as we walked back into the DMV, where my dad was waiting with an encouraging smile that only made me feel worse. The drive home was quiet and uncomfortable. I kept replaying every mistake in my head, convinced that I was probably the worst driver in the history of driving tests. My dad tried to be supportive, saying that everyone fails sometimes and that we'd just practice more, but I could tell he was disappointed too. 6 months later, I took the test again. I'd practiced religiously, spending hours working on parallel parking and three-point turns. I'd studied the driver's manual until I could recite it backwards. I felt prepared and confident walking into that DMV for the second time. This test went better than the first one, but not by much. I managed to parallel park without ending up on the sidewalk, and I remembered to signal most of the time. But I still made several critical errors, including failing to yield properly at a four-way stop and taking a turn too wide and drifting into the next lane. When the instructor told me I hadn't passed again, I wanted to disappear into the ground. The waiting area of the DMV suddenly felt like the most public place on earth, and I was convinced everyone was staring at the girl who was apparently too stupid to drive a car. I saw other teenagers my age walking out with their temporary licenses, looking excited and proud, while I collected another failure notice. This time, the disappointment was deeper and more personal. It wasn't just about driving anymore. It felt like proof that I couldn't handle adult responsibilities, that maybe I wasn't as capable as other people my age. My friends were all driving by then, and I was still getting reads from my parents like a little kid. I seriously considered giving up. Maybe I just wasn't meant to drive. Maybe I should wait another year, or just resign myself to being someone who takes public transportation forever. The idea of facing that DMV instructor a third time made me feel sick to my stomach. But my mum, who had been mostly quiet during my first 2 attempts, sat me down and shared something I didn't know. She'd failed her driving test 3 times when she was young, and her father had told her she was wasting everyone's time and money. She'd almost given up too, but decided she couldn't let fear make that decision for her. So I kept practicing. Not just the technical skills, but managing my anxiety and building my confidence behind the wheel. I practiced breathing exercises to stay calm, and I drove in all kinds of conditions, not just the easy ones. I made myself comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, if that makes sense. The third test was different from the start. I felt nervous, but it was a manageable kind of nervous, not the overwhelming panic I'd experienced before. I took my time, followed all the rules I'd memorized, and when something felt uncertain, I erred on the side of caution rather than trying to impress the instructor. When we returned to the parking lot and the instructor told me I'd passed, I actually didn't believe him at first. I asked him to repeat it, sure I'd misheard. But there it was, my temporary license, proof that persistence had finally paid off. The victory felt different than I'd imagined it would after my first failure. It wasn't just excitement about being able to drive. It was the satisfaction of not giving up when something felt impossible, of pushing through embarrassment and self-doubt to achieve something I'd worked for. That driving test taught me that failure isn't evidence that you can't do something. It's information about what you need to work on. Every mistake I made in those first 2 tests became something I could improve, not something that defined my limitations. More importantly, it taught me that some of the most meaningful accomplishments are the ones you have to fight for. The things that come easily might feel good in the moment, but they don't build the same kind of confidence and resilience that comes from overcoming real challenges. That story concludes there. 2 failures followed by 1 success, but that success meant more because of what it took to get there. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the most frustrating packages. Those failed driving tests weren't setbacks. They were education disguised as embarrassment. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the smallest gestures can echo in your memory for decades. I was sitting in 3rd grade when this girl I'd never really talked to, Amanda, noticed I didn't have a pencil for our math test. Without saying anything, she just reached into her pencil case, pulled out a perfectly sharpened number 2 pencil, and placed it on my desk with a quiet smile. I remember feeling so grateful, but also embarrassed. I'd forgotten to bring supplies again, something that happened way too often because mornings at my house were always chaotic. My mum was juggling 3 kids and a job, and sometimes the little things like checking backpacks just didn't happen. Amanda didn't make a big deal about it. She didn't announce to the class that she was helping me or act like I owed her something. She just saw someone who needed something small and provided it without hesitation. When I tried to give the pencil back after the test, she shook her head and said I could keep it. That pencil stayed with me for the rest of elementary school. I kept it in my pencil case and used it for important assignments and tests. It became my lucky pencil, and every time I used it, I thought about Amanda's quiet kindness. What struck me most wasn't just that she helped me, but how natural it seemed for her. Like looking out for classmates was just part of who she was, not something she had to think about or debate internally. She saw a need and filled it, simple as that. Amanda and I never became close friends, but that one gesture created a connection between us that lasted through graduation. We'd nod to each other in the hallways, and I always felt like I had an ally in her, someone who'd shown me what kindness looked like when nobody was watching. Years later, I became a teacher myself, and I always keep extra supplies in my classroom: pencils, erasers, notebooks, whatever kids might need. When students forget something, I think about Amanda and try to help them with the same quiet dignity she showed me. That pencil taught me that small acts of generosity can have lasting impact far beyond their immediate purpose. Amanda probably forgot about lending me that pencil within a day or two, but it shaped how I think about helping others for the rest of my life. That story ends there. It's amazing how something as simple as a pencil can become a symbol of human decency. Amanda understood something that a lot of adults never figure out. Helping someone doesn't require fanfare or credit, just the recognition that we all need small assists sometimes. That 3rd grader created a teacher who keeps extra supplies because she remembered what it felt like to receive unexpected kindness. Our next story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the best days are the ones that don't go according to plan at all. The weatherman had predicted a light dusting of snow, maybe enough to delay school by an hour or two. Instead, we woke up to 18 inches of powder and the most beautiful winter wonderland I'd ever seen. School was cancelled, work was cancelled, and the entire world seemed to have pressed pause. I was maybe 9 years old, and my initial reaction was pure excitement. A snow day meant sleeping in, watching cartoons, and maybe building a snowman if my mum felt like bundling me up for the cold. But this wasn't just any snow day. This was the kind of storm that transforms everything into a magical landscape. My mum made hot chocolate and told me I could play outside as long as I wanted, something that never happened on regular days. She bundled me up in so many layers that I could barely move, but I didn't care. I stepped outside into snow that came up to my waist and felt like I'd entered a completely different world. The silence was incredible. No cars on the street, no sounds of construction or lawnmowers, just the soft whisper of snow, still falling, and the distant laughter of other kids who'd discovered this winter paradise. I spent the morning building snow forts and making snow angels, but what I remember most was the pure joy of having nowhere to be and nothing scheduled. My neighbour kids emerged from their houses around the same time, and without any planning, we all ended up in the same yard, having an epic snowball fight. Kids I barely knew became temporary best friends as we divided into teams and built elaborate battle strategies. We were all different ages, but the snow was the great equaliser. Everyone was just a kid having fun. When we got too cold for snowball fights, someone suggested we try sledding down the big hill behind the elementary school. None of us had actual sleds, so we improvised with trash can lids, cardboard boxes, and anything else that looked like it might slide. Most of our makeshift sleds fell apart halfway down the hill, sending us tumbling into snowbanks. while laughing so hard we could barely breathe. As the afternoon wore on, more kids appeared from all over the neighbourhood. Word had somehow spread about our impromptu winter festival, and soon we had 20 kids ranging from age 5 to 15, all playing together in ways that would never happen on a normal day. We built snow sculptures, had races, and created elaborate games that made sense only to us. The best part was that there were no adults organising activities or telling us what to do next. We were completely free to follow our curiosity and energy wherever they led us. When someone got tired of one activity, we'd naturally flow into something else without any discussion or planning. As the sun started setting, casting everything in a golden glow that made the snow look like it was filled with glitter, I realised I didn't want this day to end. I'd never experienced that particular combination of freedom, joy, and connection with other kids. It felt like we'd discovered some secret about what childhood was supposed to feel like. My mum called me in for dinner just as streetlights were starting to flicker on, illuminating the snow-covered world we'd been playing in all day. I was exhausted, soaked through despite all my layers, and completely happy in a way that I couldn't have planned or scheduled. That snow day taught me that some of the best experiences happen when your normal routine gets completely disrupted. When you're forced to slow down and be present. When you can't rely on your usual entertainment or activities, you discover parts of yourself and connect with others in ways that wouldn't happen during the busyness of regular life. I learned that joy doesn't require expensive activities or elaborate planning. Sometimes it just requires snow, other kids, and the freedom to follow your curiosity without worrying about what comes next. That day showed me what it means to be fully present in a moment, something I'd spend years trying to recapture as an adult. That story concludes there. There's something magical about how natural disasters can become the best days of childhood. When all the structure disappears, kids instinctively know how to create their own joy. That snowstorm gave those children something that can't be bought or scheduled, complete freedom to just be kids together. Sometimes the universe knows exactly when we need a pause from ordinary life. Let's move to our next story, which shows how sharing what little you have can create abundance for everyone. Every summer from the time I was about 7 until I left for college, mysterious bags of vegetables would appear on our back porch. Tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, peppers, and whatever else was in season would show up in brown paper grocery bags, usually early in the morning before anyone in our family was awake. We lived in a neighbourhood where most people had small yards, but our next-door neighbour, Mr. Patterson, had somehow managed to create this incredible garden in his tiny backyard. From our kitchen window, we could see rows of perfectly tended vegetables and the small greenhouse he'd built himself using old windows and scrap wood. Mr. Patterson was probably in his 70s, a quiet man who'd retired from working at the post office and seemed to spend every waking moment either in his garden or reading on his front porch. He'd wave when he saw us, but we rarely had actual conversations beyond pleasant greetings when we passed on the street. The first time we found vegetables on our porch, my mum thought maybe they'd been delivered to the wrong house, but when she went next door to ask Mr. Patterson if he was missing a bag of tomatoes, he just smiled and said he thought we might enjoy them. He mentioned that his garden produced more than one person could eat, and he hated to see good food go to waste. What started as an occasional bag of extra tomatoes turned into a weekly delivery throughout the growing season. Every few days we'd find fresh vegetables waiting for us, always perfectly ripe and obviously picked with care. Mr. Patterson never knocked or left notes, just quietly shared the bounty from his garden. My mum started incorporating his vegetables into our meals, and I remember how much better everything tasted when it came from next door instead of the grocery store. His tomatoes were sweet and juicy in a way that store-bought ones never were, and his cucumbers had this crisp freshness that made them perfect for summer salads. As the years went on, other neighbours started receiving vegetable deliveries too. Mr. Patterson had apparently been studying who had families and who might benefit from fresh produce. The single mom across the street would find bags of vegetables on her porch. The elderly couple 2 houses down would discover zucchini and peppers waiting for them. What was beautiful about Mr. Patterson's generosity was how quietly he went about it. He never made a big announcement about sharing his garden harvest or expected thanks or recognition. He just saw that he had more than he needed and found ways to make sure it reached people who would appreciate it. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him working in his garden in the early morning hours, and I'd realise he was probably out there picking vegetables specifically for his neighbours. He wasn't just sharing his excess, he was actively cultivating abundance to give away. The vegetable deliveries created this subtle sense of community in our neighbourhood. People started talking more when they encountered each other, comparing notes about what Mr. Patterson had shared and exchanging recipes for using his produce. His quiet generosity had somehow made all of us more connected to each other. When Mr. Patterson passed away during my junior year of college, the entire neighbourhood felt the loss. Not just because we'd missed the man himself, but because those weekly vegetable deliveries had become a symbol of what it meant to look out for each other. The new owners of his house tried to maintain the garden, but it never quite produced the same abundance. Years later, when I bought my first house, I planted a small vegetable garden in my backyard. I didn't have Mr. Patterson's skill or dedication, but I remembered the feeling of opening our back door to find unexpected gifts from someone who cared about our well-being. Mr. Patterson taught me that community isn't just about knowing your neighbours' names or attending block parties. It's about finding quiet ways to contribute to each other's lives, sharing what you have when you have more than you need, and creating connections through small, consistent acts of generosity. That story ends there. Mr. Patterson understood something profound about community building. It happens one tomato at a time. He didn't organise committees or plan events, he just grew extra vegetables and shared them quietly. Sometimes the strongest neighbourhoods are built by people who never make speeches about community. They just live it every day through small acts of care. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's singing anyway. I was terrified of speaking in front of people, let alone singing, but somehow I'd gotten volunteered to perform a solo during our 4th grade music concert. Mrs. Henderson, our music teacher, had been working with me after school for weeks, helping me learn the words to Somewhere Over the Rainbow and teaching me basic breathing techniques to manage my stage fright. The song choice felt particularly intimidating because everyone knew it, which meant everyone would notice if I messed up the words or sang off key. Mrs. Henderson kept reassuring me that my voice was lovely and that I just needed to trust myself, but all I could think about was the 100+ parents and family members who'd be watching me potentially humiliate myself. The night of the concert, I stood backstage in my white button-down shirt and black pants, which was the required uniform for all performers, and felt like I might throw up from nervousness. I could hear the audience filing into the gymnasium, chatting and laughing while they found their seats. My parents had promised they'd be in the 3rd row, but that felt more terrifying than comforting. When Mrs. Henderson called my name to go on stage, my legs felt like they might not carry me to the microphone. I walked across the gym floor feeling like every eye in the room was focused on me, which they probably were. I reached the centre of the makeshift stage, looked out at all those faces, and for a moment completely forgot everything Mrs. Henderson had taught me about breathing and posture. Then the piano introduction started, and something shifted inside me. Maybe it was muscle memory from all those after-school practice sessions, or maybe it was Mrs. Henderson's encouraging nod from the side of the stage, but I took a deep breath and started singing. The first few lines came out shakier than I would have liked, but I could hear my own voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, and it didn't sound as terrible as I'd feared. As I got to the chorus, something wonderful happened. I stopped thinking about the audience and started thinking about the song itself, about the story it was telling and the emotions it was trying to convey. By the time I reached Birds Fly Over the Rainbow, why then, oh why can't I was completely lost in the music. I wasn't thinking about my parents in the third row or whether other kids would tease me later. I was just singing, really singing, in a way I'd never done in front of anyone before. When I finished the last note, there was a moment of complete silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then the applause started, and it was enthusiastic and genuine in a way that surprised me. People were actually clapping for me, not just being polite because they had to sit through a kid's performance. As I walked off stage, Mrs. Henderson gave me a huge hug and told me I'd done beautifully. Several parents stopped me afterward to say they'd enjoyed my singing, and one woman even asked if I took voice lessons. The attention felt good, but what felt even better was the knowledge that I'd faced something that terrified me and discovered I could do it. That performance changed how I thought about myself in a fundamental way. I'd always been the quiet kid who preferred reading to participating in group activities, but standing on that stage and singing showed me that I was capable of being brave when it mattered. I learned that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing important things even when you're scared. The confidence I gained from that concert extended beyond music. I started raising my hand more in class, trying out for school plays, and volunteering for presentations that I would have avoided before. I realised that most of the things I was afraid of weren't actually dangerous, just unfamiliar, and that facing them usually made them less scary. Mrs. Henderson continued working with me throughout elementary school, and I performed solos at several more concerts. Each one got a little easier, not because I stopped being nervous, but because I'd proven to myself that I could handle the nervousness and still do well. That fourth grade performance taught me that growth happens when you step outside your comfort zone, even when every instinct tells you to stay safe and hidden. Sometimes the things that scare us most are exactly the things we need to do to discover what we're capable of. That story concludes there. There's something beautiful about a teacher who sees potential in a terrified kid and patiently helps them find their voice. Mrs. Henderson didn't just teach music, she taught confidence. That fourth grader learned that bravery isn't a personality trait you're born with, it's a skill you develop by doing scary things until they're not scary anymore. Let's move to our next story, which shows how panic can transform into gratitude when the right person appears at exactly the right moment. I was 6 years old when I got separated from my mum at the mall, and it felt like the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. One minute I was walking next to her through the crowded corridors of Southdale Mall, and the next minute I realised I was surrounded by strangers and had no idea which direction she'd gone. The panic hit immediately. I started spinning in circles looking for my mum's familiar blue jacket and brown purse, but all I could see were legs and shopping bags and people who weren't her. The mall suddenly felt enormous and maze-like, with too many stores and corridors leading in every direction. I tried to remember what my mum had taught me about getting lost. Find a police officer or go to a store and ask for help. But in that moment of panic, I couldn't think clearly enough to follow her instructions. I just stood there, in the middle of the walkway, starting to cry and feeling more scared than I'd ever felt in my short life. That's when I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder. I looked up to see a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that said, "Customer Service," crouched down to my height. She worked at one of the department stores and had noticed me standing alone, looking distressed. "Hi, sweetie," she said, in the calmest, most reassuring voice. "Are you looking for your mum?" I nodded, unable to speak because I was crying too hard. She didn't seem bothered by my tears or try to rush me through, explaining what had happened. She just waited patiently while I caught my breath, and then asked me simple questions about what my mum looked like and where we'd been shopping. Her name was Linda, and she had this way of making everything feel manageable again. She explained that this happened all the time at the mall and that we'd find my mum very quickly. She took my hand and walked me to the customer service desk, talking calmly the whole time about how mums never go far when they're shopping with kids. At the customer service desk, Linda got on the intercom and made an announcement that a little girl was looking for her mum. She described what I was wearing and asked my mum to come to the customer service counter. Within 2 minutes, I could see my mum hurrying toward us, looking worried and relieved at the same time. When my mum reached us, Linda explained what had happened and reassured her that I'd been very brave and done exactly the right thing by staying in one place instead of wandering around looking. She gave me a sticker that said, "Mall Helper," and told me I could come find her anytime I needed help at the mall. My mum thanked Linda profusely and asked if there was anything she could do to show her appreciation. Linda just smiled and said that helping lost kids was part of her job, and she was glad everything had worked out. She mentioned that she had kids of her own and understood how scary it could be when they got separated. As we walked back to our car, my mum explained that there were always good people around who were willing to help when someone needed it. She said Linda was an example of the kind of person I should look for if I ever felt scared or lost again. Someone with a name tag, someone who worked at a store, someone whose job it was to help customers. That experience taught me something important about trusting the right people when you're in trouble. Not all strangers are dangerous, and sometimes the person who can help you most is someone you've never met before, who just happens to be in the right place at the right time. Linda showed me that there are people in the world whose instinct is to help, especially when they see a child in distress. She didn't have to stop what she was doing to help me, but she chose to, and she handled the situation with exactly the kind of calm competence that a scared 6-year-old needed. Years later, whenever I see a lost-looking child in a public place, I think about Linda and try to channel that same calm helpfulness. I've helped reunite a few kids with their parents over the years, and each time I remember how grateful I felt when someone noticed I needed help and took the time to provide it. That story ends there. Linda understood exactly what a terrified child needed, not lectures about staying close to mum, but immediate action wrapped in calm reassurance. She turned what felt like a crisis into a 2-minute problem with a happy ending. Sometimes heroes wear name tags and work at customer service desks, ready to help when your world feels like it's falling apart. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the most meaningful gifts aren't always the shiniest ones. My grandmother gave me a book for my 13th birthday, and at first I was disappointed. All my friends were getting video games and electronics, and here I was with a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that looked like it had been read 100 times before. The book was clearly second-hand, with a cracked spine and pages that had yellowed with age, but when I opened it, I discovered something that made it infinitely more valuable than any new book could have been. The margins were filled with my grandmother's handwriting, notes, observations, and reactions she'd written while reading it herself decades earlier. Some of her notes were simple, like "beautiful passage" or "remember this quote," but others were more personal, reflecting on how the story connected to her own experiences growing up in the South during the 1940s. She'd written about recognizing people from her hometown in Harper Lee's characters, and about conversations she'd had with her own father about justice and courage. On one page, where Atticus talks to Scout about understanding other people's perspectives, my grandmother had written, "I wish I'd learned this lesson earlier in life. Would have saved me years of misunderstanding people." Next to the passage about Mrs. Dubos's battle with addiction, she'd noted, "Reminds me of Uncle Robert. We never knew what he was fighting." Or, reading the book became like having a conversation with my grandmother about life, literature, and the world she'd grown up in. Her notes revealed parts of her history and personality that I'd never seen before. She'd always been my sweet grandmother who made cookies and asked about school, but through her marginalia, I met her as a young woman grappling with complex moral questions. Some of her observations were surprisingly sophisticated and insightful. She'd made connections between different characters that I might have missed on my own, and her questions in the margins pushed me to think more deeply about the themes Lee was exploring. It was like having a built-in book club with someone who'd lived through the historical period the novel depicted. The most meaningful notes were the ones where she connected the story to her own life. Next to the scene where Scout sees Boo Radley for the first time, my grandmother had written, We all have neighbours we make assumptions about. Mrs. Kowalski next door turned out to be the kindest woman I ever knew, but it took me years to find out. As I read through the book, I found myself writing my own notes in response to hers. I'd argue with some of her interpretations, agree enthusiastically with others, and ask questions that I wished I could discuss with her in person. The book became a bridge between our two generations, connecting her experiences with mine through Harper Lee's timeless story. When I finished reading, I realized my grandmother had given me something far more valuable than a new book. She'd given me insight into her inner life, her thought processes, and the experiences that had shaped her worldview. Those margin notes were like a personal letter written over the course of years, meant specifically for someone she loved. I started seeking out other books my grandmother had owned, hoping to find more of her handwritten thoughts. In her copy of Pride and Prejudice, she'd noted, "Elizabeth reminds me of myself at that age. Too quick to judge, too slow to forgive." In The Great Gatsby, she'd written, "Money doesn't buy happiness, but poverty doesn't either. The secret is finding meaning in what you have." That worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird taught me that the most precious gifts are often the ones that carry pieces of the giver's soul. My grandmother hadn't just given me a book. She'd given me access to her thoughts, her memories, and her wisdom. She'd shown me that the best way to connect with someone across time is through shared stories and honest reactions to them. Years later, I started writing in the margins of books I planned to give as gifts, hoping to create the same kind of meaningful connection my grandmother had given me. There's something powerful about sharing not just a story, but your response to that story with someone you care about. That story concludes there. What started as disappointment over a used book became one of the most treasured gifts imaginable. That grandmother understood something beautiful about legacy, that the most valuable things we leave behind aren't objects, but pieces of ourselves woven through those objects. Those margin notes transformed reading from a solitary activity into an intergenerational conversation about life, literature, and what matters most. Let's move to our next story, which comes from someone who learned that standing up for others doesn't require you to be the strongest person in the room, just the bravest. I was in 6th grade when this kid named Marcus started getting picked on by a group of 8th graders. Marcus was smaller than most kids in our grade, wore thick glasses, and had this stutter that got worse when he was nervous. He was also one of the kindest people I'd ever met, always willing to help with homework and never saying anything mean about anyone. The bullying started small, like most bullying does. They'd knock his books out of his hands in the hallway, call him names when teachers weren't around, and make fun of his stutter whenever he tried to answer questions in class. Marcus would just pick up his books quietly and keep walking, never fighting back or telling anyone what was happening. I watched this go on for weeks, feeling terrible about it but not knowing what to do. I wasn't popular or tough, and these were 8th graders who could easily turn their attention to me if I got involved. Part of me kept hoping someone else would step in. Maybe a teacher would notice, or Marcus would tell his parents, or the bullies would just get bored and move on to something else. But it kept getting worse. They started following him to the bus stop, pushing him around and taking his lunch money. One day I saw them corner him by the water fountains, and one of the bigger kids was threatening to flush Marcus's glasses down the toilet. Marcus was trying not to cry, which just made his stutter worse, and they were laughing at him like his fear was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. I stood there for a moment, feeling my heart pounding and my hands shaking, knowing I should do something but terrified of what might happen to me if I got involved. Then I looked at Marcus's face, saw how scared and alone he looked, and something inside me just couldn't stand it anymore. I walked over and said, loudly enough for other kids in the hallway to hear, "Hey Marcus, the principal is looking for you. She said to come to the office right now." But it's sorry, it wasn't true, but it was the first thing I could think of to create an escape route for him. The bullies looked annoyed but backed off, probably not wanting to risk getting caught by administration. Marcus looked confused but grateful, and we walked toward the office together. Once we were out of earshot, I explained that I'd made up the principal thing and asked if he was okay. Marcus thanked me quietly, and I could see he was still shaking from the confrontation. I told him those kids were jerks and that what they were doing wasn't okay. He just nodded and said he was used to it, which broke my heart because no kid should ever have to get used to being treated like that. Word got around about what had happened, and something shifted in our grade after that. Other kids started speaking up when they saw the bullying, not necessarily confronting the 8th graders directly, but creating distractions, walking with Marcus between classes and making sure he wasn't alone in vulnerable situations. The bullying didn't stop completely, but it became harder for those kids to isolate Marcus when he had people looking out for him. Teachers started noticing what was happening, and eventually the 8th graders got called into the principal's office and faced real consequences for their behaviour. Marcus and I became friends after that, not because he felt obligated to be grateful, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He was funny and smart and had insights about books and movies that always surprised me. He helped me with math, and I helped him practice reading out loud to work on his confidence with speaking. Years later, Marcus told me that the day I intervened was a turning point for him. Not just because it stopped the immediate bullying, but because it showed him that he wasn't as alone as he'd felt. He said knowing that someone cared enough to risk getting involved gave him the courage to start standing up for himself too. That experience taught me that you don't have to be the strongest or most popular person to make a difference in someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is the willingness to step forward when everyone else is stepping back. Courage isn't about not being scared, it's about caring more about someone else's well-being than your own fear. I learned that bullies rely on silence and isolation to continue their behaviour. When people start speaking up and creating community around the person being targeted, bullying becomes much harder to sustain. One voice can inspire others to find their voices too. That story ends there. Sometimes the smallest act of solidarity can shift an entire dynamic. It's incredible how one person's willingness to step forward gave Marcus what he needed most, the knowledge that he wasn't facing this alone. Bullies count on bystanders staying silent, but when someone breaks that silence, it creates permission for others to speak up too. That 6th grader learned something powerful about moral courage that day. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that peace doesn't always require company. Sometimes it just requires the willingness to be still. I was having one of those overwhelming days where everything felt urgent and stressful, and I'd been running from meeting to class to work and back again without a single moment to breathe. My phone was buzzing constantly with texts and notifications, and I felt like I was drowning in other people's expectations and demands on my time. I was walking across campus to my evening job when I passed this small hill overlooking the parking lots and athletic fields. For some reason, I stopped walking and looked up at the top of that hill, where there was just a single bench facing west toward where the sun was starting to set. Without really thinking about it, I climbed the hill and sat down on that bench. I hadn't planned to watch the sunset, hadn't even noticed it was happening until I was sitting there facing it. But once I settled into that spot, something made me turn off my phone and just sit there quietly. The sun was this incredible orange-pink colour, and it was painting the clouds in shades that looked like they belonged in an art museum rather than in real life. The sky kept changing as I watched, shifting from bright orange to deep red to purple, and I realised I hadn't actually looked at a sunset in years. Not really looked at one. As I sat there, the constant noise in my head started to quiet down. All the things that had felt so urgent and important an hour ago began to feel more manageable, like problems I could handle rather than crises that might destroy me. The stress in my shoulders started to release, and I could feel myself breathing more deeply than I had all day. People walked past on the sidewalk below, most of them looking at their phones or hurrying to get somewhere, and I realised that's exactly what I'd been doing for weeks, moving so fast and thinking so much about what came next that I was missing what was happening right in front of me. A few other people had stopped to watch the sunset too, scattered around the area, but all quietly observing the same beautiful thing. We didn't talk to each other, but there was something peaceful about sharing this moment of stillness with strangers who had also decided to pause their busy lives for a few minutes. As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon and the sky faded to darker purple, I felt more centered and calm than I had in months. Not because anything about my actual situation had changed, but because I'd given myself permission to step out of the constant motion and just exist in one place for a while. I turned my phone back on and saw all the missed texts and notifications waiting for me, but they didn't feel as overwhelming as they had before. They were just information that I could deal with when I was ready, not emergencies that required immediate panic. That evening, instead of rushing to my job and then home to more responsibilities, I moved more slowly and paid attention to things I usually ignored. The way the streetlights made patterns on the sidewalk, the sound of students laughing somewhere in the distance, the feeling of cool air on my face as the temperature dropped. That sunset taught me something important about the difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd been surrounded by people and activities all day, but felt isolated and overwhelmed. Sitting by myself on that hill, I felt connected to something larger and more peaceful than any social interaction could provide. I learned that sometimes the best way to handle feeling scattered and stressed is not to add more activity or seek more stimulation, but to subtract everything unnecessary and just be present in one moment. That bench became my regular spot whenever I needed to remember what stillness felt like. That experience showed me that peace isn't something you have to earn or achieve through perfect circumstances. It's something you can access anytime by choosing to stop moving and pay attention to what's actually happening around you, instead of what might happen next. That story concludes there. It's amazing how 20 minutes of sunset can recalibrate an entire worldview. Sometimes the cure for feeling overwhelmed isn't doing more or finding more people, it's finding the courage to just sit still. That hill taught them something that most people spend years trying to learn, that presence is a choice, and peace is always available if you're willing to pause long enough to find it. Let's move to our next story, which shows how honesty still exists in the world when you least expect to find it. I was having coffee at this little cafe downtown when I realised I'd left my wallet on the table and walked out without it. I didn't notice until I got home and started looking for it to pay for dinner delivery. My heart sank immediately because that wallet contained everything: my driver's license, credit cards, cash and my student ID that I needed to get into campus buildings. I called the cafe immediately, but they said no one had turned in a wallet. I drove back there and searched the table where I'd been sitting, checked the floor around it, and even looked in the bathroom and parking lot. Nothing. The staff was sympathetic, but confirmed that no one had found anything matching my description. I spent the next hour retracing my steps between the cafe and my car, hoping I'd dropped it somewhere visible. I checked with nearby businesses, posted on social media asking if anyone had seen it, and started mentally preparing for the nightmare of replacing all my cards and identification. The cash was gone for sure, but I was more worried about identity theft and the hassle of rebuilding my entire wallet. 3 days later, I got an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was my wallet with everything exactly as I'd left it. All my cards, my license, even the $43 in cash I'd been carrying. There was a handwritten note that said, "Found this at Grind Coffee on Tuesday. Hope it finds its way back to you safely." I was stunned. Not only had someone found my wallet and gone through the effort to mail it to me, but they'd included the cash. In a world where most people assume others will steal given the opportunity, here was proof that genuine honesty still exists. The note was written in careful handwriting on plain white paper, and it was signed simply, "A friend." There was no way for me to identify who had sent it or thank them properly. They'd used enough postage to ensure it would reach me quickly, and the envelope was addressed correctly using the information from my driver's license. I kept thinking about this stranger who had found my wallet, looked up my address, bought an envelope and stamps, and taken the time to mail it back without expecting anything in return. They could have easily kept the cash or used my cards before I had time to cancel them, but they chose to do the right thing, even though no one would have known if they didn't. What struck me most was how this person had protected my privacy and safety, even while helping me. They didn't call my phone number or show up at my house, which could have been scary even with good intentions. They chose a method that was both helpful and respectful, getting my property back to me without making me feel vulnerable. This happened during a particularly cynical period in my life when I'd been reading too much negative news and feeling like the world was full of selfish, untrustworthy people. Finding my wallet returned intact with such care restored my faith in human decency in a way that no inspiring article or motivational quote could have done. I never found out who returned my wallet, despite asking around at the cafe and posting thank you messages on community boards. This person had done something genuinely good without wanting credit or recognition for it. They just saw someone who needed help and provided it quietly and effectively. That experience changed how I think about lost and found situations. When I see something that obviously belongs to someone else, I remember my mysterious benefactor and try to channel the same energy. I've returned lost phones, turned in forgotten sunglasses, and mailed back a few lost items when I could identify the owners. The wallet incident taught me that trustworthy people are everywhere, often doing good things we never hear about. Most acts of honesty and kindness don't make the news or get shared on social media because they happen quietly between strangers who never meet each other. That story ends there. In a world where we're constantly told that trusting people is naive, someone proved that basic human decency is alive and well. The fact that they remained anonymous makes it even more powerful. This wasn't about getting recognition or feeling good about themselves. It was just about doing the right thing because it was right. Sometimes the most meaningful acts of kindness come from people whose names we'll never know. Our next story comes from someone who learned that giving away what you have can bring more joy than keeping it ever could. I was probably 8 years old when my mum announced we were going to clean out my bedroom and donate toys I'd outgrown to kids who didn't have as many. I wasn't thrilled about this idea initially because even though I didn't play with most of my toys anymore, they still felt like mine, and I wasn't sure I wanted to give them away. My mum explained that there were children whose families couldn't afford to buy toys and that my old toys could make them really happy, while just sitting unused in my closet. She said we'd keep my favourite things, but find new homes for the toys that were just taking up space. We spent a Saturday morning going through everything. Action figures I'd loved when I was 6 but hadn't touched in months, board games I'd gotten tired of, building blocks that had been shoved in the back of my toy chest. My mum let me decide what to keep and what to donate, but she encouraged me to be generous if I could. At first, I was pretty selective, only choosing toys that were clearly too young for me or that I definitely didn't want anymore. But as we worked through the pile, something shifted in how I was thinking about it. Instead of focusing on what I was losing, I started imagining kids who might get excited about these toys that had been special to me. I found myself adding more and more items to the donation pile. A remote control car that I'd loved but rarely used anymore. A set of action figures that had given me hours of entertainment but were now collecting dust. Board games that had been fun but weren't challenging enough for me now that I was older. The turning point came when I picked up this stuffed dinosaur that had been my favourite toy when I was 5. I slept with it every night for over a year and carried it around the house constantly. I hadn't played with it recently, but it still held all these memories of comfort and imagination. I held that dinosaur for a long time, thinking about how much joy it had brought me, and wondering if it could bring that same joy to another kid who needed a special stuffed animal. Finally, I added it to the donation pile, and my mum looked surprised but proud. When we loaded all the toys into bags for the donation centre, I was amazed by how much we'd accumulated. 3 large garbage bags full of toys that had been cluttering my room, but could now make other children happy. My bedroom looked cleaner and more organised, but more importantly, I felt good about what we'd done. My mum let me come with her to drop off the donations, and seeing the volunteers sort through everything made the whole experience feel more real. These toys weren't just disappearing, they were going to specific children who would appreciate them. The woman working there told me that donated toys were some of the most requested items, especially around holidays and birthdays. A few weeks later, my mum showed me a thank you card the donation centre had sent. It had drawings from some of the kids who'd received toys, including one that looked exactly like my old dinosaur. The drawing showed a little girl hugging a green dinosaur with the words, "Thank you," written in crayon below it. Seeing that drawing gave me a feeling I'd never experienced before. It was better than the excitement of getting new toys, better than winning games, better than any selfish pleasure I'd ever felt. Knowing that my dinosaur was making another child as happy as it had made me felt incredible. That story concludes there. There's something profound about learning that the joy of giving can surpass the pleasure of receiving. That 8-year-old discovered one of life's greatest truths, that happiness multiplies when you share it with others who need it more. Our final story comes from someone who learned that the most important words are often the hardest ones to say. I was 22 years old and hadn't told my dad I loved him since I was probably 7. It wasn't that we had a bad relationship, but we'd fallen into that typical pattern where men in our family just didn't express emotions directly. We'd show care through actions, help each other with practical things, but actual feelings were kept buried under layers of small talk about work and weather. My dad was the kind of man who showed love by teaching me to change oil, by staying up late, helping with school projects, by working extra hours to pay for things I needed. He wasn't distant or cold, just not someone who used emotional language easily. And I'd inherited that same awkwardness around vulnerability. When I was in college, I'd call home once a week, and our conversations followed the same pattern every time. How are classes going? How's the weather there? Did you see the game last weekend? We'd talk for maybe 15 minutes, cover all the safe topics, and end with, "Talk to you next week," instead of anything that acknowledged how much we actually meant to each other. This went on for years. I'd come home for holidays and we'd spend time together, enjoy each other's company, but never cross that invisible line into saying anything too personal or meaningful. It was like we'd both agreed that keeping things surface level was safer than risking the awkwardness of genuine emotional expression. Then my dad had a heart attack when I was 26. It wasn't massive, and the doctors said he'd be fine with some lifestyle changes, but sitting in that hospital waiting room made me realise how much time I'd wasted being emotionally distant from someone who meant everything to me. When I went into his room and saw him lying there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him, something broke open in me. We made small talk for a few minutes about the doctors and when he might come home, but then I couldn't stand it anymore. I looked at him and said, "Dad, I love you." Just like that, no build-up or explanation, just the words I'd been avoiding for almost 20 years. He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I'd made him uncomfortable, crossed some line we weren't supposed to cross, but then tears started running down his face and he said, "I love you too, son. I've wanted to say that for so long." We both started crying then, and it wasn't awkward or embarrassing like I'd always imagined it would be. It was just relief, like we'd both been holding our breath for years and could finally exhale. All that time we'd wasted dancing around the most important thing we could say to each other. My dad recovered completely from his heart attack, and our relationship changed fundamentally after that conversation. We still talked about practical things, but we also started saying what we actually meant. Phone calls ended with, "I love you," instead of "talk to you later." Visits included real conversations about life and feelings and things that mattered. The heart attack was scary, but in some ways it was also a gift because it forced us to stop pretending that emotional distance was somehow more comfortable than emotional honesty. We realised that all those years of avoiding vulnerability had cost us opportunities for real connection. My dad lived for another 15 years after that, and I'm grateful that we spent those years actually telling each other how we felt instead of just assuming the other person knew. When he passed away last year, I had no regrets about things left unsaid because we'd learned to say them while we still had time. That story ends there. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make us realize that the words we're most afraid to say are exactly the ones that need to be said. That father and son wasted decades dancing around love when they could have been living in it. The most tragic part isn't that they almost missed their chance. It's how many people never get that hospital room moment that forces honesty. If you enjoyed this batch of stories and need something to help you fall asleep or get in the zone, consider subscribing for more. Thank you for listening in, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.